The high vaulted ceilings of the royal registry seemed to hold the very breath of 1,000 forgotten seasons. Dust drifted, a fine glittering cascade in the scarce light. Across the long, high-set windows where the world outside, the noisy, clamoring world of the new Gilded Age, was reduced to a distant, indifferent hum. The air inside carried the soft, pervasive scent of aged velvet and cooling brass, the atmosphere of wealth preserved and history officially vetted. This was the entrance hall, a grand, echoing chamber meant to impress visiting dignitaries and obscure the quiet. Meticulous work done in the back corridors. Every surface here gleamed, polished relentlessly by servants who understood that the true strength of the kingdom lay in its visual narrative of opulence. The floor was a mosaic of polished obsidian and white marble, reflecting the muted light from the enormous, unlit chandeliers above. But for the archivist, this very sheen was an illusion, a superficial layer designed to hide the structural decay beneath. He knew that beneath the Gilded Age of prosperity and aggressive expansion, there existed a profound shadow. This shadow was composed of uncomfortable truths, reckless expenditures, and the increasingly desperate actions of a king whose ambitions outpaced his resources. The archivist walked slowly, his footsteps absorbed by the vastness of the hall, merely a flicker of movement in the ambient imagery of stillness. He paused by a massive bronze statue of the founding king, noticing the faint, oily texture left by the hundreds of hands that touched it daily, seeking favor or inspiration. The statue's surface was pristine, but the pedestal beneath it had a fine, almost invisible crack running through the marble, a physical metaphor for the stability of the entire reign. He carried a single, heavy key, not the iron key to the subterranean vault, but a lighter, older brass key meant for the personal offices of the king's late secretary. These offices were rarely used now, sealed away like an embarrassing relative, but they held the records of the kingdom's earliest, most aggressive financial dealings that led directly to the current era of excessive display. His motion was calm and reflective, driven not by haste but by the quiet certainty of duty. He felt a deep curiosity about the motivations of the previous generation, the architects of this age who had knowingly traded long-term stability for immediate, dazzling showmanship. Every glint of gold in this hall represented a hidden debt, a promise quietly broken. He reached the heavy, unadorned door to the disused offices. As he inserted the brass key, the sound was a quiet, grinding scrape, immediately absorbed by the thickness of the oak. He pushed the door open, revealing a room shrouded in deep shadow. The air inside was stale, utterly dead, carrying a faint, musty scent of forgotten spices and old leather. This was where the Gilded Age was manufactured, away from the prying eyes of the populace. The room contained 2 large, formidable desks. One was clean, ready for use, a public declaration of ongoing work. The other was a ruin, piled high with disorganized scrolls, scattered pens, and open, unbound account ledgers. This mess was the shadow of the official office, the place where the true figures were hastily calculated and then rewritten for presentation. He lit the single candle he carried, its small, struggling flame casting dancing shadows that elongated the furniture and transformed familiar shapes into lurking forms. The painterly detail of the room, captured in the warm, uncertain light, revealed layers of neglect. Dust thick on the window ledges, a spiderweb shimmering like forgotten silk in the corner, and the subtle discoloration of the wallpaper where a leak had been hastily covered years ago. The archivist felt a familiar sense of regret, a historian's ache for the truth lost not to destruction, but to deliberate disorganization. The goal of the original schemers wasn't simply to steal, but to muddy the waters so thoroughly that no one could ever piece together the initial crime. He began his methodical search, his movements guided by the medium rhythm. Gentle pauses of a sleep story narration, slow, deliberate, hypnotic. He was looking for a specific series of notes, rumored to detail the earliest construction costs of the royal palace's secret tunnel system, the very tunnels that had been falsely recorded as drainage maintenance. This expense was the foundation of the current financial double ledger. In an age dedicated to surface appearance, what unseen force truly holds the structure together? He located a small wooden box beneath the desk, secured with a simple clasp. It contained only thin sheets of brittle parchment, covered in hurried, feverish script. These were not official records, but private notes. The king's secretary, late at night, trying to reconcile the true, unsustainable costs of the king's public projects with the official, manageable figures presented in the court. The scent of the parchment was distinct, drier, sharper, carrying the metallic tang of cheap, hastily mixed ink. He handled the sheets with the utmost care, his fingers sensing the fragility of the paper and, metaphorically, the fragility of the entire Gilded Age structure. He found a page detailing a conversation between the king and his secretary concerning the necessity of eliminating the unseemly truth from the ledgers, replacing it with a plausible golden narrative. This was the birth of the administrative lie, the moment the shadow was intentionally cast over the truth. He recognized the true nature of the king's current paranoia. It wasn't fear of discovery by others, but fear of his own past catching up to him. The king's memory was now actively trying to reject the truth that founded his power, leading to the demand for the royal decree to simplify the past. The archivist meticulously copied the key figures from the old notes into his personal cipher notebook, making sure to reproduce the scribbled marginalia detailing the real expenses. This was his micro-hook, the key piece of evidence linking the old deceit, the Gilded Age, to the new deceit, the simplification decree. He was quietly assembling the case against the official history. He closed the wooden box, his task complete. The psychological layer of the search weighed on him, the sadness that so much human energy and talent had been spent on covering up weakness rather than building true strength. The emotional cue was one of nostalgia, not for the past, but for the honesty that had been sacrificed for the illusion of greatness. He stood up, extinguishing the candle with a gentle, muffled puff of air, plunging the secretary's office back into a silent, dense darkness. He locked the heavy oak door, the quiet click signaling the restoration of the official secret. But the shadow under the Gilded Age was not simply a financial lie. It was a psychological condition, a sickness that now threatened to consume the very memory of the kingdom, requiring the archivist to use his most trusted system, the protocol of the double ledger. The archivist moved away from the abandoned secretary's office, feeling the cold, smooth texture of the brass key against his palm. He walked through the echoing, silent corridors of the registry, where the true light of day was always held at bay. The air here was thin, carrying only the faintest scent of fine leather and polished wood, an illusion of activity that contradicted the profound stillness of the hour. He reflected on the inherent danger of the Gilded Age, not the danger of open conflict, but the corrosive risk of prioritizing surface beauty over foundational truth. The entire structure of the kingdom, from its high tariffs to its aggressive expansion, was predicated on the public accepting a glorious, shimmering lie. He felt a deep archival nostalgia for the simpler, poorer times when a king's word was often backed by clear, albeit meager, accounts instead of this elaborate, two-tiered fiction. He reached a section of the main library dedicated to foreign treaties, a room where the air was noticeably drier and carried the powerful odor of imported indigo ink and official seal wax. A different, less personal scent than the wax of the king's inner vault, but just as authoritative. He used a tiny, specialized brush to gently dust the spine of a massive, cloth-bound volume titled The Instruments of Debt and Alliance, 1690-1705. He was searching for evidence of the cost of the Gilded Age's foreign policy, the secret subsidies paid to keep small nations quiet, the inflated prices paid for foreign trinkets to maintain the aura of royal wealth, and the quiet transactions that bypassed the kingdom's own banks. All of these were components of the shadow that now extended over the entire world stage. He found a small, unmarked scroll tucked behind the main ledger. It was tied not with the official silk, but with a piece of rough gray twine. As he unrolled the scroll, its brittle parchment creaked faintly in the profound silence. This was a private memorandum from the king's trade representative, a document too truthful to ever be officially recorded. It detailed the exact cost of the king's grand tour, revealing that the expenses officially noted were less than a tenth of the actual money spent, the difference paid in secret, high-interest loans secured against the kingdom's future tax revenue. This was the true price of the spectacle, the painterly detail that history was meant to erase. The archivist felt a resurgence of his deep curiosity. He was connecting the domestic deceit, the secret tunnels, the double ledger, with the international deceit, the hidden debts. The quiet insanity in the Hall of Mirrors wasn't just the king's. It was the entire kingdom's shared delusion, carefully curated by the administration. He carefully transcribed the crucial loan figures into his cipher. The light from his small, polished lantern was the only illumination, casting his immense, distorted shadow on the wall behind him, a fleeting image of the true, unseen power he wielded. He was not a minister or a general, but a keeper of numbers. Yet he held the kingdom's destiny more surely than any man of the court. How long can a kingdom sustain itself when its grandest narratives are built entirely upon deliberate, documented illusion? He closed the scroll, replacing it exactly as he had found it. The task was not to expose the shadow, but to preserve the record of the shadow, knowing that the official history would soon move to annihilate it, completely under the royal decree to simplify the past. The archivist was creating a hidden archive for the historian of the future. He moved on to the adjacent room, the Hall of Cartography. This was a space of enormous rolled maps and the sharp, volatile scent of fresh oil paint and turpentine, remnants of the king's obsession with redrawing borders and staking imperial claims. The room was dominated by a huge map of the kingdom, currently undergoing correction to extend the royal territories further than they actually reached, a lie in geographical form. He noticed a small, metal canister sitting beneath the main work table. He opened it, revealing not maps but personal letters sealed with simple brown wax. These were correspondences between the king and his spymaster, exchanged during the early years of the Gilded Age. The letters detailed the use of intelligence funds, not for national security, but for personal blackmail against powerful nobles whose financial integrity threatened to expose the fragility of the royal coffers. The spymaster was the dark enforcer of the Gilded Age lie, ensuring silence not through military might, but through the subtle art of document forgery and psychological pressure. The archivist felt a wave of profound regret. The shadow extended not just over the balance sheets, but over the moral fabric of the ruling class. The emotional cue here was sadness at the waste of potential. He realized the immense and sudden danger he was in. His current task of exposing the foundational lie of the Gilded Age was leading him directly into the path of the king's spymaster and the silent threat. The spymaster did not care about the truth. He only cared about the efficient removal of obstacles. The medium rhythm, gentle pauses of his work suddenly felt very slow. very exposed. He needed to expedite his preparations for the grand archival misdirection. He was no longer just a researcher. He was a silent, intellectual combatant against a powerful, hidden enemy. He did not read the entire letters. He merely confirmed their nature and sealed the canister once more. The hypnotic repetition of his movements, closing, sealing, replacing, was a mask for the rising tension in his heart. He knew his next step must be decisive. He needed the physical key to the greatest vulnerability of the Gilded Age, the hidden library of personal confessions and sealed, medically sensitive reports. He needed the key to the private bibliothèque, but the archivist still had to find the one final expense ledger that confirmed the king's earliest descent into paranoia, the true beginning of the shadow. The archivist felt a cool draft sweep through the cartography hall, the faint scent of oil paint mingling with the ancient dry smell of the palace stone. It was a subtle sensory detail that emphasized the profound silence of his late-night surveillance. He had secured the evidence of the international lie, completing the picture of the kingdom's systemic financial deception rooted in the shadow under the Gilded Age. He needed only one final piece to confirm the psychological depth of the current king's descent. He left the cartography hall and proceeded down a narrow, rarely used stairwell leading to the registry of forgotten claims. This area was a labyrinth of low-ceilinged rooms where the records of property disputes, dismissed petitions, and ancient royal grants were stored. History too dull or too embarrassing to ever be officially consulted. The light of his small lantern seemed weak here, fighting against the dense, historical darkness. The texture of the air changed again. It was heavy and metallic, carrying the faint, sharp odor of rust from the old iron shelving and the residual dust from decayed red tape. This was a place of human regret, where every document represented a hope permanently extinguished by royal decree. He sought the records pertaining to the pre-Gilded Age Treasury audit, the final, honest accounting conducted just before the massive, reckless spending began. This audit had been officially misfiled years ago, a crucial administrative maneuver to ensure the new regime's books started clean. He found the box tucked into a low recess beneath a pile of moldering land deeds. It was a simple pine box, its lid secured by brittle leather straps. As he carefully lifted the straps, the creak of the old wood was startlingly loud in the profound stillness. Inside lay the final, unadulterated ledger. Unlike the public and shadow books, this one was bound in plain canvas and smelled of simple, honest iron gall ink. It detailed the exact deficit incurred by the king's father, a debt so crippling that the current king was forced to launch the Gilded Age, the spectacular illusion of wealth, just to borrow enough money to stay solvent. The extravagance was not a choice. It was a desperate, inherited necessity. This ledger revealed the true source of the paranoia written in the margin of the king's soul, the crushing fear that he was merely a spectacular administrator of another man's ruin. The shadow under the Gilded Age was, in essence, the ghost of his father's debt. He felt a deep human empathy for the king, not as a ruler, but as a son burdened by an impossible legacy. This understanding lent a new solemn tone to his actions. His duty was no longer merely to preserve the truth, but to preserve the context of the king's tragic decision. To what degree is a man responsible for the shadow cast by the mistakes of his predecessors? He transcribed the final critical figures detailing the inherited deficit into his cipher. These numbers were the foundational micro-hook, proving that the current administrative chaos was an effect, not a cause, of the financial sickness. His personal ledger, his cipher, was becoming the true honest double ledger of the kingdom. He closed the canvas ledger, replacing it and resealing the box with the brittle straps. He had now linked all the threads: the crushing inherited debt, the resulting financial lie, the protocol of the double ledger, the necessity of physical concealment, the archival tunnel to the outside wall, and the desperate, late-stage effort to erase the foundational shame, the royal decree to simplify the past. He extinguished the lamp, allowing the ambient imagery of the historical darkness to return to the forgotten claims area. The profound silence settled back into the room, making it feel as if time itself had been folded and put away. The archivist rose, turning his attention toward the next phase. He had gathered the evidence needed to understand the current crisis. Now he needed to act on that understanding. His quiet victory in documenting the shadow under the Gilded Age meant he was ready to face the physical danger required to shield the actual records. He knew that the success of his mission, the quiet rebellion against the king's decree, now depended entirely on gaining access to the one area that would provide both the final, definitive truth and the perfect hiding place for the evidence, the key to the private bibliothèque. Dust settled, a fine ancient powder across the broad oak surface of the master desk, catching the single beam of muted candlelight. The air in the archive was never truly fresh. It was a compound essence of centuries, of dried ink and aged paper, of brittle leather bindings, and above all, the soft, pervasive scent of wax. This was not the sweet perfume of the dinner hall's tapers, but the duller, heavier fragrance of the royal seals, the very breath of official sanction, heavy with linseed oil and the deep crimson pigment of a king's authority. The archivist, known only by the quiet rhythm of his footsteps, moved through the corridors where silence was a physical thing, an oppressive pressure against the ears. The stone floor beneath his worn slippers was cold, a chill that seemed to emanate not from the winter outside, but from the immense weight of the history stored above it. He carried a small copper lantern whose tiny, struggling flame cast dancing, misshapen shadows, the true inhabitants of the royal archives. Each shadow seemed to lengthen and distort, whispering the names of kings long buried and the secrets that outlived them. Tonight, the focus was the inner vault, a space beneath the Hall of Mirrors where light never penetrated, save for his own fragile beacon. The iron door was thick, its surface etched with the fine, spidery script of an ancient protection charm, now mostly illegible, softened by time and the ceaseless rubbing of passing hands. As he turned the massive, cold key, a key whose teeth were precisely matched to a lock fashioned centuries ago, the sound was a slow, metallic groan immediately absorbed by the dense mass of the surrounding stone. Inside, the royal secrets slept. They lay within hundreds of cylindrical containers, each one crafted from tightly rolled vellum and secured not by string, but by the heavy application of the aforementioned wax. Each seal bore the intricate impression of the king's signet ring, confirming the document's truth and, ironically, ensuring its eternal seclusion. The deeper the secret, the thicker the wax. It was an unspoken rule of the archives, understood only by those whose hands were stained permanently with the pigment of official decrees. The air here was stiller, colder. It carried a sharper edge of the archival scent, an almost mineral quality mixed with the faint, sweet decay of old silk used for the document ties. The archivist felt a familiar, quiet wonder, standing in the presence of so much undisturbed history. It was a kind of timeless museum, not of objects, but of decisions, of alliances forged, betrayings whispered, and destinies irrevocably altered by a simple scratch of the king's quill. He began his nightly task, the inventory of silence. This involved checking the integrity of the seals on the most sensitive documents. His fingers, trained over decades, were exquisitely sensitive to the texture of the wax, the smoothness that indicated it had remained untouched, the minute crack that might signify a breach, or a desperate, forgotten attempt to spy on the past. He worked without sound, his movements economical, a dance of duty in the dark. The painterly detail of the room was overwhelming yet soothing. Deep shadows clinging to the vaulted ceiling, the heavy dark wood shelves rising in endless, mute columns, and the occasional gleam of tarnished silver from a decorative hinge. Sometimes, he would pause, letting the only sound be the soft, high hiss of the lantern wick struggling against the damp air. He often wondered about the original scribes, the ones whose hands had formed the looping, careful letters on the vellum. Did they know the consequences of the words they recorded? Did they too feel the heavy weight of conscience that came with preserving truths that could destroy fortunes or start wars? It was a nostalgia not for a time he knew, but for the universal human experience of bearing witness. The scroll he sought this evening was not a treaty or a decree, but a personal ledger, hidden among dozens of superficially identical containers. It held the king's private accounts, specifically those related to the expenses incurred during the construction of the infamous archival tunnel to the outside wall. This project was officially listed as drainage maintenance, a lie so grand it had become foundational. The real purpose of the tunnel was something the archivist had yet to fully grasp, though he suspected it was the key to understanding the king's recent, unsettling paranoia. He located the ledger by its distinct seal, a small, irregular indent near the bottom edge, where the wax had briefly cooled too quickly before the press. Gently he lifted the tube. It felt dense, heavier than it looked. He did not break the seal, for the act of retrieving the information was distinct from the act of reading it. His duty was to confirm the secret still slept. What drives a soul to preserve what time wishes to forget? He lowered the ledger back onto its shelf, the soft thud echoing lightly in the vast empty space. He imagined the scene that led to its creation. The king, perhaps late one night alone in his study, signing the authorization for the secret expense, the wax cooling on the desk while outside, the great gilded palace slept, oblivious to the subterranean machinations. The archivist felt a curious curiosity, a yearning to bridge the centuries and witness that singular moment of secret genesis. The lantern's light flickered, momentarily shrinking the room, then surging back, pushing the shadows into deeper corners. The scent of the wax intensified as the heat from the lamp warmed the air near the shelf. It was the smell of power contained, of volatile information held captive by brittle chemistry. He ran a fingertip along the ridge of the binding. Beneath the rigid discipline of his work, there was a profound sense of regret, not for his own life, but for the inherent flaws in men and kings that required such elaborate systems of concealment. He moved on, his attention drawn to a stack of diplomatic correspondence stored in a shallower chest. These documents concerned the protocol of the double ledger, a system he himself had implemented years ago to record transactions both accurately and misleadingly. The muted candlelight caught the gold thread woven into the velvet lining of the chest, a tiny flash of aristocratic splendor utterly out of place in this subterranean, utilitarian chamber. He leaned in, his breath disturbing a fine layer of dust on the leather. The slow rhythmic air in his lungs and the faint drip of water somewhere far off in the palace's plumbing were the only sounds of life. This chamber was a monument to suspended time, and he was its solitary keeper. He saw the painterly detail of his own reflection, a vague, ghostly image, in the polished bronze handle of the chest, a silent figure in a world of written ghosts. The deep psychological landscape of the archive always brought him to the same conclusion. The true horror of history is not in the violence it records, but in the deliberate erasure of the mundane details that would explain the violence. The royal secrets he guarded were not spectacular tales of treasure, but dry, bureaucratic evidence of moral compromise. He checked the final shelf in this aisle, documents pertaining to the king's health, specifically the physician's secretive addenda. These medical notes were kept entirely separate from the main archival body, sealed with a simple black wax, signaling extreme confidentiality. The archivist had never opened them, knowing that some secrets were too destabilizing even for the trusted keeper to possess. He merely confirmed the seal was solid, the black wax cold and unforgiving beneath his touch. He felt the subtle psychological depth of the silence surrounding him. It wasn't just the absence of noise, but the presence of unvoiced truths. Every document was a mind frozen in time, and every silence was a choice. The archivist was simply the man who enforced those choices. As he turned to leave the inner vault, the copper lantern swung slightly, casting a momentary, huge shadow of his figure on the far wall, the silent, looming guardian of all that the kingdom wished to forget. He locked the iron door again, the heavy metallic clunk signifying the world's return to manageable ignorance. He walked back, the scent of wax clinging to his clothes, a temporary badge of supreme trust. He knew that tomorrow he would be required to access another section, a section dedicated entirely to the king's strange, obsessive interest in simplifying the historical records. A request that smelled less of administrative efficiency and more of deliberate, calculated deceit. But no one knew which secrets the archivist had hidden behind the locked door, nor the truth buried beneath the royal decree to simplify the past. The faint, resonant echo of the archivist's slippers against the polished marble staircase marked his ascent back toward the inhabited levels of the palace. Upward, the air grew marginally warmer, thinner, and less burdened by the scent of ages. The single flame of his lantern threw a hesitant, golden glow onto the frescoes lining the stairwell, depictions of triumphant royal ancestors whose deeds were now guarded and, in some cases, silently amended by the man ascending below them. This ascent was always a transition, a deliberate shedding of the deep archival stillness for the superficial life of the court. He reached the landing of the outer ward, where the walls were clad in rich tapestries, thick with wool and woven images of hunting scenes and courtly love. These walls absorbed all sound, creating pockets of manufactured quietude designed to shield the royal family from the external world. He paused by a tall arrow-slit window, noting the ambient imagery outside. A drizzle of rain had begun, slicking the cobblestones of the inner courtyard and sending thin, glistening runnels down the face of the stone. Each drop sounded like a faint, melancholic sigh against the palace walls, perfectly aligning with the reflective mood of the late hour. In the outer ward, the pervasive smell of wax gave way to a new composite scent. The faint perfume of expensive foreign incense burned hours ago in the Queen's chambers, mingled with the sharp tang of recently extinguished torchlight from the guards' rotations. The difference between the archives and the court was one of honesty. The archives smelled of truth preserved, while the palace smelled of truth masked. The archivist continued toward his own modest rooms, located in a quiet wing known formally as the Registry of Lesser Titles. He carried with him not just the lantern, but the psychological weight of the information he had just confirmed was secure. His duty was often less about recording new history, and more about maintaining the rigid integrity of the existing secrets. He thought again of the physician's notes, sealed with the unforgiving black wax. The king had been exhibiting signs of profound paranoia, of fear not of external enemies but of his own recorded past. This was the silent engine driving the new, unsettling administrative requests. To simplify the past was to erase the inconsistencies that haunted the king's troubled mind. The archivist felt a rising sense of curiosity, driven by the professional urge to link the seemingly disparate threads. The secret tunnel, the private ledger, the medical addenda, and the growing, urgent need to rewrite the kingdom's memory. He stepped inside his chamber. It was Spartan. A narrow cot, a desk perpetually covered in low-priority scrolls, and a single unadorned shelf holding his personal effects. He placed the copper lantern on the desk, where its tiny, struggling flame cast dancing shadows on the ceiling, momentarily making the familiar room seem vast and strange. The only relief from the muted tones of the archival life was the deep, rich texture of his own worn woolen blanket. He pulled a chair up to the desk, not to work, but merely to sit. This was his process of internalizing the night's discoveries, a quiet meditation on the power dynamics within the stone walls. He was the only man who knew the precise location of every lie and every truth. This knowledge was his power and his burden. The calm, archival tone of his internal monologue rarely wavered. Emotion was a luxury incompatible with the preservation of institutional memory. How does one differentiate between loyalty to a ruler and fidelity to the permanent truth? He picked up a small, smooth riverstone he kept on his desk, a tactile reminder of the world beyond the palace walls. The coolness of the stone was a pleasant contrast to the warmth left by the wax of the inner vault on his fingertips. His eyes tracked the gentle, persistent rain against the window pane. The sound was an essential component of the sleep story narration of his life, a continuous, soothing hum that spoke of the indifference of nature to the frantic, mortal struggles of kings and courts. He recalled the look of the vellum in the private ledger, its surface dry and brittle, yet holding the very fluid history of the king's recent descent into suspicion. This transition from a stable ruler to one obsessed with historical manipulation was the true subject of the archives now. Everything pointed toward the royal decree to simplify the past, the next inevitable step. That decree would require the archivist not just to guard secrets, but to actively participate in the subtle art of document forgery, the highest crime against his sacred calling. He closed his eyes, inhaling slowly. He caught the lingering scent of parchment on his hands, a smell that had been his constant companion for 40 years. It was the scent of his life, his purpose, and now perhaps his downfall. The medium rhythm, gentle pauses of his breathing settled into the rhythm of the rain. He focused on the memory of the cold, heavy iron of the vault door, a physical embodiment of the barrier between the kingdom's official memory and the king's actual history. He opened his eyes, feeling the gentle tug of wonder at the vastness of the enterprise he managed. He was the quiet, unseen hinge upon which the past turned. He was a keeper of secrets, yes, but more importantly, a keeper of the contradictions that made history real. The king wished for a seamless, purified timeline. The archivist knew that history, like life, was defined by its flaws and its double ledgers. This knowledge was his micro-hook, the tiny point of leverage in a world of overwhelming power. He was preparing for the inevitable confrontation, not with swords or open dissent, but with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a man who knows where the original documents are hidden. He rose and extinguished the lantern with a gentle puff. The room plunged into near-total darkness, relieved only by the faint ambient imagery of the street lamps filtering through the damp glass. The silence returned, not the oppressive silence of the vault, but the hypnotic quiet of anticipation. The king's decree was coming, demanding the impossible, the destruction of truth. The archivist knew that the only way to genuinely lose the king's memory was not to burn it, but to hide it so effectively that only another archivist, centuries later, might stumble upon its location confirming that the public history that became a lie was, in fact, an expertly crafted administrative deceit. He lay down on his cot, pulling the heavy textured woolen blanket up to his chin, the cold stone of the palace still pressed against the air, a vast, calm, and reflective monument to the illusion of permanence. He was now just a sound in the darkness, a heart beating in time with the steady rain. But the archivist had already begun to contemplate the meticulous process required. The exact procedure needed to execute the protocol of the double ledger on a national scale, ensuring that the king's lie would be recorded and the truth silently preserved. The archivist lay perfectly still, integrating the subtle signals of the night. The rain had softened, transitioning from a rhythmic tapping to a gentle, pervasive whisper against the ancient stone. Even in darkness, the scent of the archives, the heavy, dry perfume of paper, and the specific mineral odor of the royal secret's wax seemed to permeate his very being. It was the smell of time given form, and it calmed him. He contemplated the concept of the quiet insanity in the Hall of Mirrors. The hall, where all official records were read and royal edicts proclaimed, was the seat of manufactured transparency. Its surfaces were dazzling, reflective, and intended to show the king as an unwavering pillar of state. Yet the archivist knew the reality was quite the opposite. The mirrors reflected a truth that the king, in his increasing paranoia, could no longer tolerate. The messy, flawed truth of his own reign. The insanity was the systematic denial of reality, driven by a fear so profound it was now demanding the retroactive cleansing of history itself. The impending decree, ostensibly meant to standardize or simplify the sprawling royal documents, was in fact an order for self-betrayal. It would require the archivist to use his deep knowledge of the protocol of the double ledger, the system designed to protect the kingdom's financial stability, to instead actively destabilize its historical integrity. He felt a profound regret for the necessity of this betrayal, a sadness for the moment when his sacred duty to the past conflicted directly with his temporary obedience to the crown. He drifted closer to sleep, yet the psychological depth of his profession kept a part of his mind acutely alert. He recalled the moment decades ago when he was entrusted with the key to the private bibliothèque. This key was not merely a tool for opening a door. It was a physical symbol of the king's absolute trust, granting him access to the ultimate repository of personal, unfiltered, and potentially ruinous documentation. He hadn't just guarded the records. He had curated the raw material of the king's soul. The betrayal inherent in the new decree was not just administrative, it was personal. He shifted slightly on his narrow cot, the simple motion disturbing the profound stillness of the room. The ambient imagery of the night outside seemed to press against the thin walls, the shadows of the sleeping castle, the faint, distant sounds of the changing guard muffled by the distance and the enduring rain. If the objective truth is lost to preserve stability, is that not simply trading one form of madness for another? He imagined the sheer volume of material that would need to be processed under the new mandate. Thousands of documents, each one carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of parchment and its own silent story. The task was not just about removing contradictory texts, but about inserting subtle supporting documents. The subtle art of document forgery. This required not a heavy hand, but a mastery of ink pigmentation, period script, and the precise aging process of vellum, skills that elevated him from a mere clerk to the silent, looming guardian of the kingdom's entire self-perception. He focused on the rhythmic, hypnotic nature of his breathing, using it to anchor himself against the swirling complexities of the court's deception. He had always found calm and reflection in the mechanical nature of his duties, the precise, ordered world of the archive. Now, he needed that same discipline to carry out the necessary disorder, to preserve the king's memory by losing it, scattering the true documents into the deepest, most inaccessible recesses of the archive, effectively burying them alive. The medium rhythm, gentle pauses of his thought process continued to work through the logistics. He would need to utilize the secret construction details he had confirmed earlier, the expenses related to the archival tunnel to the outside wall. That tunnel, meant perhaps as an escape route for the king or a conduit for smuggling treasure, would now serve as the ultimate unintended hiding place for the king's inconvenient truths, a secret physical passage to preserve the intellectual integrity of the past. The archivist felt a quiet moment of wonder at the irony. The very mechanism created by the king's paranoia would become the means of salvation for his historical reputation, ensuring that centuries later the full story, not the simplified lie, could potentially be unearthed. The original documents, once hidden, would become his final, silent testament to the weight of carrying a king's conscience. He knew this was the micro-hook of his future action. His job was no longer to obey the king's decree to simplify the past, but to cleverly circumvent it, ensuring the public history that became a lie was merely a temporary official facade. He would not burn the past. He would merely bury it meticulously within the sprawling, chaotic heart of the archive itself. As the first faint, muted candlelight of dawn began to seep under his door, the archivist finally allowed himself to rest, the lingering texture of the cold wax on his fingers a comforting reminder of the truth he protected. But the real threat lay not in the documents he hid, but in the attention he would draw when he began the elaborate, deceptive process required by the new law, especially the scrutiny of the king's spy master and the silent threat. The air in the registrar's audit chamber was a strange, subtle blend of competing scents: the dry, mineral odor of freshly ground charcoal used for erasure, the rich, oily smell of new ledger ink, and a faint, sweet essence of unopened rice paper. This was the atmosphere of meticulous, continuous financial control, a space dedicated to the illusion of perfect balance. The chamber was large but simple, deliberately devoid of the Gilded Age spectacle found elsewhere in the palace. Instead of tapestries, the walls were lined with pale, utilitarian shelving, holding hundreds of massive accounting volumes, their canvas bindings uniform and mute. The only light came from a single low-hanging brass lantern, whose steady, unwavering glow cast long, precise lines onto the wide, clean oak table where the work was done. At the center of this table lay the double ledger itself, its name a whispered promise of both truth and necessary deception. The volume was enormous, bound in thick, scarred oxhide, the leather cold and smooth beneath the archivist's touch. It was less a book and more a physical manifestation of the kingdom's financial philosophy: stability through managed contradiction. The archivist sat, his posture straight, his movements minimal. He was contemplating the protocol, the intricate set of rules he himself had designed years ago to govern this duality. The protocol was never written down. It existed only in his precise memory, a coded language of marginal marks and reverse summations. The book was divided down the middle by a seam of tightly woven gold thread. The left side was the public ledger, designed for official display. Its entries were broad, optimistic, detailing revenues and expenditures meant to satisfy merchant guilds and foreign banks. The script here was bold and declarative, suggesting immediate, robust solvency. This side smelled faintly of the pride of presentation. The right side was the shadow ledger. Here the script was minuscule, dense, and brutally honest. This side contained the true cost of the shadow under the Gilded Age, the secret subsidies, the high-interest foreign debts, the ruinous personal spending of the crown and the enormous, hidden expenses associated with projects like the archival tunnel to the outside wall. The archivist's duty now was to initiate the yearly adjustment, the crucial moment when the documented controlled lie was brought into temporary, partial alignment with the dangerous truth. This process required a quiet technical betrayal of the very numbers he served. He dipped a fine-tipped quill into his private inkwell, the dark, viscous liquid clinging to the feather. The gentle scratch of the quill as he tested it on a scrap of paper was the most pronounced sound, quickly absorbed by the surrounding volumes of stored data. His work was methodical, demanding a level of focus that bordered on the hypnotic. He began by reviewing the official expenditure for royal defense renovations in the public ledger. This figure, though large, was a mere fraction of the true military cost. The remainder hidden under various discrete headings in the shadow ledger: emergency grain storage, maintenance of coastal lighthouses, and diplomatic contingency funds. He experienced a subtle wave of wonder at the ingenuity of the system. The protocol of the double ledger ensured that if any casual auditor, even a clever one, only reviewed the public book, the kingdom appeared financially sound. But if they gained access to the shadow book without the key of the protocol, the financial reality would appear catastrophically ruined. The truth was protected by being made unusable. He began the first adjustment, adding a fictional charge for emergency vellum acquisition to the public ledger. This small, believable lie allowed him to secretly offload a portion of the real, unacknowledged debt related to the tunnel project from the shadow book. The painterly detail of the script was essential. The number had to look natural, the ink aged correctly, the weight of the pen matching the scribe who had entered the surrounding figures months ago. What is the moral weight of a number that is simultaneously true in one ledger and false in another? The ambient imagery of the room was one of oppressive order. Rows upon rows of volumes, each one a monument to a past financial decision, all bathed in the constant, unchanging amber of the brass lantern. The stillness was palpable, broken only by the medium rhythm, gentle pauses of his work. He thought back to the initial crisis that necessitated the protocol, the vast, inherited debt revealed by the shadow under the Gilded Age. The double ledger wasn't born of malice, but of survival. It was an acknowledgement that a kingdom must sometimes lie about its strength to its enemies and its citizens, to ensure its continuity. He felt a deep historical nostalgia for that original pure intention. But the king's current command, the forthcoming royal decree to simplify the past, sought to corrupt the protocol's purpose. It was demanding that the archivist apply this method of financial deceit to the non-financial narrative history of the kingdom. The king wanted to use the precision of the double ledger to create a false historical account, rather than a shielded financial one. The archivist recognized the profound regret that came with his expertise. He knew exactly how to execute the deception for the king, and that was his burden. He was the only man who could perfectly forge the simplified history, and the only man who could secretly preserve the real truth simultaneously. His hand trembled slightly as he entered the final figures for the session, a series of complex internal transfers designed to confuse any external review of the shadow book. He created a ghost account, an entity that existed only as a cipher reference in his private notebook. This was his micro-hook against future scrutiny, even from the king's most trusted agents. He was preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the king's spy master and the silent threat. The spy master would not understand the intricacies of the protocol, but he would search for evidence of disloyalty. By making the shadow book impossibly complex, The archivist was creating an impenetrable bureaucratic shield. He leaned back, breathing slowly, inhaling the heavy scent of parchment and ink. He had successfully buried the true cost of the Gilded Age deeper within the protocol. The financial books now slept soundly under the watch of his meticulous deceit, but the archivist had yet to decide how he would protect the king's most personal secrets, the sensitive medical files and confessional documents whose existence was driving the quiet insanity in the Hall of Mirrors. The faint, sharp scent of dried charcoal, used to correct inevitable errors, hung subtly in the cold air of the audit chamber, a constant reminder that even the most rigorous system, the protocol of the double ledger, was subject to human fallibility. The archivist knew that his work on the financial records was complete, but the true threat lay in the king's demand to apply this principle of deception far beyond mere numbers. He stood up, stretching muscles stiffened by the profound stillness of his focus. He moved to the small, unadorned table in the corner, where the archival inventory was kept. Here the atmosphere was less about calculation and more about inventory. The scent of parchment and cold, dry leather dominated. His purpose now was to prepare for the inevitable purge. The king's decree to simplify the past was not a request for a lighter history book. It was an order to actively create a public history that became a lie. The archivist was tasked with eliminating any document that contradicted the king's preferred self-image, a process that required immense psychological depth to execute flawlessly. He began by cross-referencing the inventory against the list of problematic documents secretly supplied by the king's secretary. The list included not only reports on the debt from the shadow under the Gilded Age, but also personal confessions, letters of intense paranoia written in the king's own hand, and the sensitive medical findings found in the physician's secretive addenda. He felt a deep sense of regret and curiosity. The protocol was meant to shield money, ensuring the kingdom's survival. Now it was being twisted to murder truth, ensuring the king's comfort. His medium rhythm, gentle pauses in his movements reflected the internal battle between his duty to the crown and his duty to history. He needed a way to apply the concept of the double ledger to physical objects. He decided on a system of controlled misfiling, creating shadow locations within the archive where the true damaging documents would be moved. The original official slots would then be filled with meticulously crafted forgeries, the public documents that would support the streamlined lie. This was the ultimate expression of the protocol. Two histories existing simultaneously, one visible and false, one hidden and true. If an archival record is perfectly falsified, yet the original truth is preserved, which version does history ultimately judge? He pulled out a set of old leather tags and began marking them with a unique sequence of symbols. Symbols that appeared to be simple inventory codes, but which were in fact ciphers for the shadow location of the real documents. The painterly detail of the symbols was crucial. They had to look exactly like the work of the primary registry scribe, despite being an invention of the archivist. He worked under the dim, hypnotic glow of the corner lamp. The texture of the old leather tags was rough and familiar. He had to think like a forger, focusing on sensory detail. The slight, uneven spacing of the holes, the exact type of twine used for attachment. This was the subtle art of document forgery applied not to a single document, but to the entire administrative structure. The greatest challenge was the security logs. Any movement of such sensitive documents would be noted. He had to create a third ledger, a deception within the deception, that would record the removal of the documents under a plausible pretense, such as transfer to conservation or temporary storage for pest treatment. This was the final, desperate layer of the protocol of the double ledger. He began a small, insignificant notebook, labeling it Pest Control and Preservation Log. This became his hidden shadow book for document movement. Every time he moved a truth, he recorded a plausible lie in this small notebook. The ambient imagery of the room, the mute shelves, the still, dry air, provided the perfect cover for this intellectual concealment. He knew that the entire scheme could only be executed by gaining unfettered private access to the hidden library, a space so secure and so deeply personal to the king that no one would ever suspect documents were being moved from it. He needed the key to the private bibliothèque. The lock on that door was the final barrier between the king's public sanity and his private ruin. He tucked his small cipher and the new pest control log into the deepest pocket of his robe. He had used the protocol of the double ledger not to serve the king's lie, but to subvert it, turning the mechanism of deceit into the mechanism of preservation. But the archivist had not yet accounted for the king's most vigilant protector, the man whose specialty was seeing beyond the subtle art of document forgery and straight into the heart of silent disobedience. A reckoning awaited him with the king's spy master and the silent threat. The archivist felt a creeping chill, not from the stone walls, but from the realization of the risk he now undertook. He was not merely documenting, he was committing the subtle art of document forgery on a systemic scale, using the protocol of the double ledger against the king who had sanctioned it. His hands, stained faintly with the scent of parchment and ink, were now tools of quiet intellectual subversion. He walked toward the exit of the audit chamber, the cold, smooth texture of the vast mahogany table passing beneath his fingertips one last time. He focused on the quiet, rhythmic medium rhythm, gentle pauses of his own footsteps, using the steady sound as an anchor against the rising tide of historical crisis. He paused near the main entrance, where a narrow, specialized set of records documenting the royal decree to simplify the past were already being assembled. These files detailed the specific lists of items to be purged or rewritten. He noticed the heavy, unfamiliar seal on the official instruction packet, a seal he recognized as belonging not to the registry, but directly to the spy master. This subtle detail confirmed the true nature of the operation. This was not a bureaucratic streamlining, it was a military-grade historical cleanup. The king's spy master and the silent threat was overseeing the deletion process personally, meaning the archivist's every move would be watched, not by clerks, but by trained intelligence operatives. He felt a flash of adrenaline, quickly suppressed and replaced by calm and reflection. His psychological depth told him that his defense could not be counter-espionage. It had to be perfect, flawless bureaucracy. He had to make the lie so plausible that even the spy master, focused on finding treason, would only find impeccable administrative procedure. He turned toward the nearest window, letting the cold, dry air brush his face. The ambient imagery outside was dark, the palace lights few and distant, emphasizing the isolated nature of his struggle. He thought of the quiet insanity in the hall, of mirrors, where the king was being driven mad by his own unsustainable fiction. The archivist was creating a silent sanctuary for the truth, even if it meant risking his life. He reviewed his plan. The true, sensitive documents, the physician's secretive addenda, the private letters, the original debt records from the shadow, under the Gilded Age, would not be transferred to conservation as the fake log stated. They would be quietly moved through the service routes until they reached the entrance of the archival tunnel to the outside wall, the secret construction project he had meticulously documented. The tunnel, built for the king's paranoid escape, would serve as the ultimate unintended repository for the weight of carrying a king's conscience. The painterly detail of the plan was exquisite, a physical escape route converted into an intellectual refuge. If an archivist must choose between saving his life and saving the historical record, where does his true loyalty reside? He felt a deep sense of wonder at the interconnectedness of the deceit. Every lie had created a contingency for the truth. The protocol of the double ledger was now his shield and his sword. He had used its principles to create a hidden, parallel reality. He was ready. He had confirmed the financial lie, understood the psychological trigger, and prepared the administrative cover story. The only remaining piece was the physical access to the heart of the secrets. He secured his lantern and his cipher, turning to face the quiet labyrinth of the palace. His final, immediate task was to obtain the small, tarnished prize that would unlock everything. The key to the private bibliothèque. The Hall of Mirrors was not cold, yet the air within it carried a distinct chilling scent of pure, polished glass and stale, heavily filtered air. It was a room designed to deny reality, a vast, luminous vessel dedicated entirely to the presentation of perfect, unassailable royal power. The silence here was immense, a manufactured vacuum where even a whisper seemed too loud, swallowed instantly by the sheer expanse of reflective surfaces. Every wall was lined with tall, arched mirrors, each one framed in thick, ornate gilding that gleamed faintly in the sparse, muted candlelight filtering from the palace exterior. The floor was made of highly buffed, dark stone reflecting the mirrored ceiling and creating an optical illusion of infinite repeating space. The texture of the room was smooth, slick, and utterly uncompromising. The archivist stood near the end of the hall, a small, dark figure dwarfed by the dizzying repetition of his own image. He was the only person awake in this immense, silent gallery. He moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, navigating the dizzying reflections. His task tonight was not archival, but observational, to witness the physical space where the king's mental state had begun to fracture. He knew that the quiet insanity was not a sudden break, but the result of the king's decades-long commitment to the financial lie known as the protocol of the double ledger and the unsustainable extravagance of the shadow under the Gilded Age. The Hall of Mirrors, which should have confirmed his greatness, now only multiplied his fear. He carried a small covered lantern, its single struggling flame casting dancing shadows that were instantly duplicated into 1,000 tiny wavering lights. This proliferation of light and shadow was precisely the psychological mechanism of the room. It denied a single truth, replacing it with an infinity of possibilities, none of them reliable. The archivist felt a profound curiosity about the nature of royal power witnessed through this lens. The king, forced to project unwavering solvency while secretly managing crippling debt, had spent years performing absolute confidence here. The mirrors had reflected the perfected public history that became a lie, until the king could no longer distinguish that reflection from his own burdened reality. He noticed a subtle, painterly detail on the far wall. One of the tall mirrors was slightly askew, not cracked, but tilted barely a fraction of an inch, creating a visual jolt that threw the entire symmetry of the room into chaos at that specific angle. It was a minuscule flaw, yet it felt like the physical manifestation of the king's cognitive break. He walked toward it, his image fragmenting and reassembling with every step. The atmosphere was calm and reflective, yet deeply unsettling. He understood the psychological depth of the room. It was a monument to self-obsession, designed to show the king nothing but his own majesty repeated endlessly, until the very concept of self became lost in the overwhelming visual noise. If a ruler sees only reflections of their desired strength, can they ever truly recognize the actual vulnerability that threatens them? He reached the tilted mirror. Looking into it, his own face appeared briefly fractured. The single image of the archivist momentarily split into two. He gently adjusted the frame. It moved easily, suggesting the tilting was not accidental but intentional, perhaps a secret moment of frustration from the king himself, a silent attempt to shatter the illusion without anyone noticing. He felt a deep sense of regret for the king, trapped in the infinite echo chamber of his own power. It explained the increasingly desperate need for the royal decree to simplify the past, the frantic effort to impose a single, simple, manageable truth onto a history that had become as chaotic and multiplying as the Hall of Mirrors itself. He ran his fingers over the gilded frame, the cold texture of the brass leaving a faint metallic scent on his skin. He was looking not for historical documents, but for the sensory detail of human vulnerability. A scratch, a tear, anything that proved the king was still a man, and not just another endless reflection. He found nothing but smooth perfection. The king's struggle was internal. The room itself was merely an amplifier. This realization was the micro-hook that guided his next move. The most sensitive private records wouldn't be in the public archive, but in the one place the king went to escape his multiplying reflections. He recalled the physician's secretive addenda, the notes detailing the king's descent into paranoia, the belief that he was being observed not by enemies, but by the records of his own past. The king needed to see his history as clean and singular, just as he needed the mirrors to stand straight. The tilt in the glass was the physical representation of the archival contradictions he sought to eliminate. He turned, walking back down the vast length of the hall. His steps were slow, almost hypnotic, their rhythm echoing the silent internal countdown to the great historical purge. The ambient imagery of the room began to take. While the brass key, small and ancient, lay in the palm of the archivist's hand, cool and heavy against his skin. It was not a grand object, lacking the sharp, imposing presence of the iron vault keys. Instead, it was tarnished, its head worn smooth by centuries of discreet use, its texture a history in miniature. It carried a faint, coppery scent that spoke not of gold or silver, but of honest, enduring metal. This was the key to the private bibliothèque, and it felt like the concentrated weight of carrying a king's conscience. He stood in a dimly lit, narrow corridor near the king's private apartments, a space defined by deep shadow and the oppressive quiet of the sleeping palace. The air here was unlike the archives. It was closer, warmer, carrying the residual odor of fine wool and expensive foreign oils, the personal atmosphere of the king, unburdened by the must of public record. The bibliothèque itself was behind a simple, unadorned oak door designed to be overlooked, to appear as a storage closet, rather than the repository of the king's soul. There were no gilded mirrors here to multiply the image. This was a space of single definitive truth, the antithesis of the quiet insanity in the Hall of Mirrors. The archivist inserted the brass key into the lock. It slid in with perfect, silent ease, a testament to the skill of the long-dead locksmith. As he turned it, the mechanism gave a soft, yielding snick, a sound instantly absorbed by the thick wood and the surrounding silence. The quiet was profound, magnifying the psychological depth of the moment. He was crossing the final barrier between the public history that became a lie and the raw, dangerous truth. He pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. The air within the bibliothèque was dense, cool and immediately distinctive, a dry, clean scent of cedar and old untouched paper, the aroma of preservation taken to its highest, most secretive form. He did not light his lantern immediately, allowing his eyes to adjust to the faint ambient imagery, the pale, silvery light of the moon filtering through a single, tiny high window revealing the towering presence of the bookshelves. They rose from floor to ceiling, their wood dark and polished, their contents hidden behind glass doors. He felt an immense professional wonder. This was the ultimate archive, a collection curated not by the state but by the king's own fears and fascinations. Every book here was an artifact of personal decision, containing the king's unfiltered journals, the sensitive diplomatic exchanges, and the original, raw documentation that founded the shadow under the Gilded Age. He felt a deep sense of nostalgia for the concept of this room, a place where a king, stripped of his ceremonial titles, recorded his genuine thoughts. This room existed as an acknowledgement that even the highest authority needed a single, honest witness. Now that honesty was what the king most desperately wished to destroy. He quietly lit his lantern, the small candle flicker casting a gentle, muted candlelight over the nearest shelf. The painterly detail of the scene was one of deep, scholastic silence. The dark wood, the faint gleam of the glass, the absolute stillness of the books waiting patiently for the return of the only eyes meant to read them. He was searching for two specific categories of documents, which he knew to be here. The private journals detailing the planning of the archival tunnel to the outside wall, and the confidential medical reports, the physician's secretive addenda. These were the twin pillars of the king's current crisis, the paranoia and the mechanism of his planned escape. He found the journals first, located behind a false front disguised as a collection of Latin poetry. They were small, bound in simple, unadorned leather, their texture soft and yielding. He did not open them. He merely confirmed the handwritten label on the spine. He was not here to read, but to save. When we choose to hide our greatest truths from the world, are we protecting ourselves or merely giving our fears a perfect sanctuary? He moved down the aisle, the sound of his slippers against the heavy rug almost imperceptible. He was looking for the documents related to the protocol of the double ledger. Not the financial records, but the initial theoretical notes outlining the need for systemic deception, the intellectual genesis of the lie. He found them in a folio marked Moral Philosophy, a final, ironic hiding place. The archivist felt a sharp pang of regret that a place of such purity, a private library, had been twisted into the command center for the destruction of truth. He recognized that his possession of the key to the private bibliothèque made him the final and most dangerous witness to the king's decline. He located the medical reports in a separate, small chest of drawers, clearly designed for immediate secret access. These files were bound in plain cotton tape, utterly free of any official seal or wax, a further indication of their absolute confidentiality. This contained the evidence of the paranoia written in the margin, the true reason behind the forthcoming purge. He secured the bundles under his cloak, careful not to disturb the profound stillness of the room. The total weight of the documents was light, yet the weight of carrying a king's conscience felt immense. His actions now constituted high treason, an intellectual subtle art of document forgery aimed at protecting history from its current master. He was executing the decision to burn or to bury, and the library was now the starting point for the burial. He had to ensure that when the king's spymaster and the silent threat arrived to execute the royal decree to simplify the past, these crucial documents would be gone, replaced by convincing, official-looking forgeries. He turned to the exit, casting the hypnotic glow of his lantern over the silent shelves one last time. He had accessed the king's mind, understood the mechanism of his madness, and secured the documents that would save the kingdom's true history. The simple brass key had unlocked everything, but no one knew which path the archivist would take after leaving the solitude of the bibliothèque, nor the danger awaiting him as he approached the mouth of the archival tunnel to the outside wall. The archivist slipped out of the bibliothèque, closing and locking the unadorned oak door with a tarnished brass key. The quiet click of the ancient mechanism was swallowed by the plush, silent carpets of the royal wing. He secured the key to the private bibliothèque once more, feeling the light, familiar texture of the brass against his hand, a small, potent weapon against the vast machinery of deception. His immediate destination was the heart of the palace's administration, the central registry where the inventory for the royal decree to simplify the past was officially held. He had secured the true documents. Now he had to plant the believable administrative lie that would explain their sudden absence. This required the execution of his own defensive deception, a maneuver worthy of the protocol of the double ledger. The corridors here were colder, the air carrying the thin professional scent of low-grade parchment and quick-drying gum. He moved past rows of sleeping clerks' desks, all shrouded in deep shadow in the stillness of the deepest night. The light from his hidden lantern was carefully shielded, casting only a faint, muted candlelight circle around his feet. He reached the main filing cabinet, a large dark oak monolith secured by a simple modern lock. This was where the pest control and preservation log, his forged document movement record, needed to be officially inserted. He used a common-grade palace key to open the cabinet, the metallic scrape sounding unnaturally loud. He pulled out the legitimate inventory binder for sensitive documents transfer and conservation. He felt a wave of curiosity about the people who normally worked here, the mundane functionaries whose daily tasks were now being leveraged for treason. He saw the official logs pages covered in neat, anonymous script. The public history that became a lie required the perfect administrative camouflage. He carefully inserted his own, forged log pages into the binder. The subtle art of document forgery demanded that the paper stock and the ink color match perfectly, suggesting the entries had been made weeks ago. His log detailed the urgent transfer of the physician's notes, private correspondence, and foreign loan documents to a climate-controlled vault beneath the West Wing, citing concerns about silverfish and extreme humidity, a believable lie that was impossible to immediately disprove. Does the preservation of one's sacred duty sometimes require the perfection of the very deceit one despises? He paused, letting the immense weight of carrying a king's conscience settle upon him. He was committing a high crime, yet he felt a moral clarity, a profound calm and reflection. This administrative lie was his necessary armor against the king's spymaster and the silent threat. When the spymaster came to purge the files, he would find no treason, only bureaucratic overreach, a forgivable offense in the Gilded Age court. He closed the filing cabinet with a soft thud, securing the fabricated record. He now had the original secret secured under his cloak, and the official lie secured in the registry. The gap in history was sealed, both physically and administratively. He needed to move the physical documents now. The bundles under his cloak felt distinct, the smooth, cold texture of the medical files, the physician's secretive addenda, the rougher scent of parchment from the old debt records, the shadow under the Gilded Age, and the delicate bindings of the king's journals, the paranoia written in the margin. He moved quickly to the hidden service stairwell near the kitchen wing, an area free of guard posts and surveillance. The air here smelled of old grease and damp stone, a world away from the refined deception above. He began his descent, The ambient imagery of the stairwell was one of relentless stone and darkness. The medium rhythm, gentle pauses of his feet on the cold steps, the only evidence of his progress. He was descending to the absolute foundation of the palace, where the original medieval stone met the modern, desperate construction. His final destination was the entrance to the notorious escape route he had identified through the financial records. The tunnel built beneath the oldest, thickest part of the palace wall. He was turning the king's act of paranoia into a safe haven for historical truth. He felt a deep sense of wonder at the irony. The king, driven to madness by his own records, had unwittingly created the perfect place for them to survive his purge. This unexpected convergence of deceit and salvation was his final microhook. He knew that the tunnel entrance was disguised as a coal chute in the lowest furnace room, a place rarely visited, reeking of cold ash and damp earth. He had the key, the records, and the administrative cover. He was ready for the decision to burn or to bury, and he was choosing the difficult path of intellectual burial. But no one knew that the spy master's informants were already following the false paper trail of the pest control log, and that the final, most dangerous confrontation awaited the archivist at the mouth of the archival tunnel to the outside wall. The air in the king's private bibliothèque, now unlocked by the key to the private bibliothèque, was dry, cold, and possessed a unique, metallic scent of fine paper and dried medicinal herbs. This was the atmosphere of profound professional confidentiality, a space where the physical body of the king was documented with the same meticulous precision usually reserved for the body politic of the kingdom. The bibliotheque's main purpose was intellectual storage, but its deepest, most private corner held the medical cabinet, a tall, dark cedar structure entirely unadorned. It contained not treatments but records, the physician's secretive addenda. These were the notes the royal physician dared not commit to the official royal health ledger. The truths too dangerous for any eyes but his own. And now the archivist, moving with the heavy bundles of the king's journals and private debt records tucked beneath his cloak, approached the cabinet. His recent movements, securing the secrets of the shadow under the Gilded Age and creating the deceptive administrative cover using the protocol of the double ledger, had led him here, to the very source of the king's current volatile state. He lit his small, copper lantern and placed it on the floor. The muted candlelight cast a warm, isolated glow that emphasized the stillness of the room and the isolation of the cedar cabinet. The texture of the wood was smooth, almost oily, polished by generations of discreet handling. He opened the cabinet with a small silver skeleton key that had been attached to the brass bibliothèque key. Inside, the documents were not bound in leather or secured with royal wax, but wrapped in plain rough cotton tape, signaling ultimate, desperate secrecy. The sensory detail was immediate. The cotton felt coarse, humble, a stark contrast to the luxurious lies of the court. He located the specific packet labeled simply, Addenda, 1720, present. These notes documented the king's descent into the quiet insanity in the Hall of Mirrors. He did not need to read every page. He needed only to confirm the physician's diagnosis of profound paranoia written in the margin of his patient's behavior. He unrolled the first scroll. The physician's script was tight, almost microscopic, revealing an intense professional regret for having to record such dangerous truths. The note spoke of sleep loss, uncontrollable rages against the written word, and the king's growing obsession that the archive itself was conspiring against him. The diagnosis was clear. The king suffered from a delusion that his own historical and financial records were actively mocking him, forcing him to destroy the history of the kingdom to save his own mind. This psychological depth confirmed that the royal decree to simplify the past was not a strategic move, but a cry for help, warped into an administrative order. He felt a deep sense of wonder at the physician's courage. He had recorded this truth knowing that if the king ever found it, it would mean his life. The physician was another quiet hero of truth, a man whose duty to his patient conflicted directly with his loyalty to his sovereign. What is the duty of the professional when the truth of the state directly threatens the sanity of the sovereign? The archivist carefully slipped the entire bundle of physician's secretive addenda beneath his cloak, joining the other secrets. The weight of carrying a king's conscience grew heavier, now encompassing the king's mental vulnerability. His mission had shifted from merely preserving history to protecting the reputation of a tragically broken man. He realized this was the final, critical step before enacting the great administrative deception. He had secured all the contradictions, the financial, the historical, and now, the psychological. He stood before the open cedar cabinet, its dark, empty shelves now reflecting the faint ambient imagery of the single lantern. He needed to place a convincing substitute back into the cabinet, a decoy truth that would distract the king's spymaster and the silent threat if the cabinet were ever breached. He pulled a small, plain vellum scroll from his own robe, a generic, harmless list of prescribed herbal remedies and dietary restrictions, dated a decade prior. He secured it with a fresh length of cotton tape and placed it back on the shelf. This was the subtle art of document forgery applied to medicine, replacing a psychological time bomb with a nutritional footnote. The medium rhythm, gentle pauses of his work were slow, deliberate. He was not just acting, he was creating a counter-narrative of plausible normalcy. His hands moved with the practiced ease of a man who understood that sometimes the greatest truth is hidden behind the most boring lie. He closed the cedar cabinet, locking it once more with the small silver key. He now had everything he needed. His next action would be the final, irreversible physical step of preservation, the decision to burn or to bury, but the archivist had not accounted for the possibility that the very act of obtaining the physician's secretive addenda had been silently observed, and that his path to the tunnel was already compromised by the king's spymaster and the silent threat. The archivist secured the small silver key and turned away from the cedar cabinet, the bundles of the physician's secretive addenda pressing securely against his side beneath his cloak. The documents felt cool, their fragility a constant reminder of the immense weight of carrying a king's conscience. He had successfully infiltrated the king's personal sanctuary, and now the critical records of the king's paranoia were in transit. He left the bibliothèque, closing the door softly and locking it with the brass master key. The silence of the royal wing returned, dense and unbroken. His next movement had to be perfect, the silent, undetected transport of these critical secrets to the lowest level of the palace, where the archival tunnel to the outside wall lay hidden. He began his descent through a rarely used network of service stairs, moving away from the polished grandeur of the upper floors and into the rougher utilitarian underbelly of the castle. The air changed dramatically, losing the scent of fine oils and gaining the mineral odor of damp stone and persistent mildew. The chill was immediate, seeping into the dense fabric of his robe. As he descended, he thought again of the physician, the quiet historian of the king's mind. The addenda confirmed that the king was being driven by an intense fear of the inconsistency of his own past, a fear exacerbated by the conflicting narratives of the shadow under the Gilded Age, and the cover story provided by the protocol of the double ledger. This was the essence of the quiet insanity in the Hall of Mirrors. He found a momentary resting spot on a worn wooden landing, setting his copper lantern down carefully. The muted candlelight barely cut through the darkness, casting deep shadows that seemed to cling to the rough, unpainted walls. He allowed himself a brief moment of calm and reflection. He was performing his own complex, emotional, subtle art of document forgery, not rewriting history, but replacing the official location of history with a credible lie. He felt a professional wonder at the irony of his situation. The same systematic mind that created the elaborate deceit necessary for the kingdom's solvency was now being used to preserve the truth from the system itself. He was using the logic of the Gilded Age against its creator. When the only way to save a truth is to declare it missing and bury it, does the act of concealment outweigh the virtue of preservation? He checked his pocket for the pest control and preservation log, the administrative decoy that was meant to divert scrutiny. He had relied on the spymaster's reliance on paperwork, the assumption that even the most ruthless agent would respect the official procedures of the registry. The texture of the cheap paper felt thin, a fragile shield against the immense external threat. He knew that the king's spymaster and the silent threat would not be fooled by the lie forever. The logs would only buy him hours, maybe less. The spymaster specialized in seeing the paranoia written in the margin. He would recognize the sudden, massive transfer of sensitive material as an act of preemptive treason. The decision to burn or to bury was coming to its violent climax. He reached the lowest level, the furnace rooms. The atmosphere shifted again, thick with the dry, choking scent of cold ash and stagnant coal dust. The ambient imagery here was purely utilitarian. Massive dark iron furnaces, stacks of wood, and the occasional gleam of tarnished silver from a forgotten tool. He moved toward the far corner, near the massive, thick foundation of the old medieval wall. Here, disguised by a pile of unusable coal slag, was the entrance to the tunnel. A low, square opening sealed by a heavy stone slab that lifted only with the precise application of leverage. This project, documented as drainage maintenance, was the king's last desperate act against perceived enemies. He placed the bundles of secrets, including the vital physician's secretive addenda, on a clean cloth near the opening. The medium rhythm, gentle pauses of his breathing were the only sounds, competing with the faint, steady drip of water somewhere deep within the stone. He prepared to pry open the slab, the most physically strenuous part of his quiet rebellion against the royal decree to simplify the past. But as he reached for the lever, a tiny, subtle shift in the shadows behind him, a sound that was not a drip but the faintest scrape of a leather boot, signaled that his meticulous plan had failed to account for one final crucial variable. The spymaster was here waiting, having followed the scent of the truth to its burial site. The archivist was trapped, poised between the light of the archives and the darkness of the tunnel, with the entire public history that became a lie resting in his lap. The air in the archivist's small, utilitarian office was heavy with the scent of dried ink and newly sharpened graphite, a sharp contrast to the damp, earthy air of the furnace rooms he had just escaped. He was no longer in physical danger, having narrowly avoided the king's spymaster and the silent threat at the mouth of the archival tunnel to the outside wall. But the psychological aftermath of the near confrontation lingered. He sat at his familiar wooden desk, the single candle burning low, its muted candlelight casting a frail, steady glow that seemed to absorb the immense surrounding darkness. The documents he had rescued, the king's personal journals, the physician's secretive addenda, and the old financial records detailing the shadow under the Gilded Age, lay before him a silent, fragile pile of historical truth. His immediate task was to analyze the core psychological driver of the crisis, the paranoia written in the margin of the king's own documents. The true history of the kingdom was not only recorded in the text, but revealed in the spaces surrounding the text, the erratic scribbles, the angry deletions, the vast, deliberate emptiness. He opened the king's most recent private journal, a volume bound in simple black unadorned leather, its texture smooth and cool. The script inside was usually bold and assured, reflecting the public certainty promoted by the protocol of the double ledger. But in the last 6 months, the entries had become fractured. The text itself still detailed royal tours and administrative successes, the public history that became a lie. But in the wide, pale margin, the silent space designed for commentary, the truth screamed. Here, the king had filled the empty paper with minute, feverish notations, drawings of eyes, repeating motifs of locking mechanisms, and questions written so tiny they could only be read with a magnifying glass. Are they reading the numbers back to me? Did the paper shift? The ink smells different today. The sensory detail of the king's delusion was pervasive, a chronic, relentless fear that the inanimate materials of his own government were sentient and hostile. The archivist felt a deep, professional curiosity about the point where administrative deception transitioned into personal collapse. He realized that the king's fear was not just of exposure, but of memory itself. The quiet insanity in the Hall of Mirrors was the public manifestation. The marginalia was the private, terrifying descent. He used a fine-tipped pen to gently trace the path of the king's paranoia. He noted the increasing frequency of the marginalia, realizing that the king's obsession with destroying the past, the essence of the royal decree to simplify the past, was a desperate attempt to stop the written records from witnessing him. If the act of documentation is a silent form of accusation, can true power ever exist without an unwritten record? The ambient imagery of the room was dominated by the faint scent of old wax and royal secrets that still clung to the rescued documents. The painterly detail focused on the contrast between the bold, clean lines of the main journal entry and the terrifying, chaotic energy confined to the narrow margin. It was a visual representation of a mind split between public duty and private terror. He understood that this paranoia was the true source of the kingdom's vulnerability, a weight heavier than any financial debt. The king was being undone not by his enemies, but by the very archive he commanded. The archivist felt a deep regret for the man who had succumbed to the pressure of the Gilded Age illusion. He turned to the oldest recovered ledger, the one detailing the original catastrophic deficits. Here the paranoia was latent, taking the form of excessive, unnecessary deletions. The subtle art of document forgery being practiced on a small scale, years before the crisis. The king was already trying to erase the ghost of his father's debt. He secured the documents he had just analyzed. The psychological evidence was vital. It elevated his actions from mere treason to a necessary preservation of historical context. He was carrying the weight of carrying a king's conscience, which was now revealed to be a fragile, shattering thing. The archivist knew he had only a few hours of darkness left. The spy master had been alerted, and the administrative lie, the fake preservation log created by the key to the private bibliothèque, would soon be exposed. He had to complete the final unrecorded act of the decision to burn or to bury before dawn. He stood, his gaze fixed on the narrow margin of the king's journal, a testament to the fact that even the most meticulously ordered life can break down into desperate, tiny scribbles. But no one knew the precise nature of the danger that awaited him now, a confrontation far from the palace walls at the unexpected, dark exit of the archival tunnel to the outside wall. The faint, sharp scent of graphite from the archivist's pencil lingered in the air, mixing with the historical scent of parchment from the documents he had just secured. He had completed his analysis of the paranoia written in the margin, understanding that the king's psychological fragility was the true context for the entire crisis. The texture of the worn desktop beneath his hands felt cold, grounding him in the quiet reality of his small office. He knew that the mere act of having rescued the secrets, the physician's secretive addenda, the private journals, the financial truths from the shadow under the Gilded Age, was not enough. His administrative deception, using the logic of the protocol of the double ledger, was designed to delay, not stop, the king's spymaster and the silent threat. The spymaster would be moving now, using his own dark methods to track the missing material. The archivist began the final preparations for his escape and concealment. He pulled out a small, heavy velvet pouch, meant originally for holding royal medals but now repurposed. He carefully placed the fragile documents inside, protecting them from the damp and the pressure of transport. The weight of carrying a king's conscience was now a palpable, physical burden. He felt a deep sense of nostalgia, not for the past, but for the simple, uncomplicated duty of his early career. Before the age of historical manipulation, he was forced to become a spy to remain an archivist. He rose, turning his attention to the windows. The ambient imagery of the pre-dawn sky was a bruised, dark gray. Time was running out. He needed to be gone and the secrets buried before the palace began to stir. His calm and reflection was absolute, a protective shell against the surrounding chaos. He had prepared a small, unassuming travel cloak, woven from a dark, rough wool, a texture that would blend perfectly with the shadows of the service tunnels. He secured the velvet pouch inside the lining. He considered the precise nature of the king's marginalia again. The tiny, desperate scribbles were the king's last honest attempt to communicate his fear, before succumbing completely to the quiet insanity in the Hall of Mirrors. The king was destroying the public history that became a lie because he could no longer bear the weight of his own witnessed truth. If an archive is a mirror, and the ruler cannot bear his reflection, is it the mirror or the ruler that must be shattered? He picked up his copper lantern. Its muted candlelight was a symbol of hope and persistent truth, its steady, warm glow contrasting sharply with the coldness of the stone. He extinguished it immediately, knowing that light was now his greatest enemy. He would trust the natural darkness, navigating by the faint outlines of the palace architecture. He needed to move to the lowest levels, the area where he had barely escaped the spymaster earlier. He was heading for the final rendezvous point, the secret exit point confirmed by the financial records relating to the archival tunnel to the outside wall. He moved through the hallways, his slippers making no sound against the stone. He was now relying entirely on his mastery of the palace's hidden geography, his long career as a silent, lurking guardian paying its ultimate dividend. The medium rhythm, gentle pauses of his movement were timed to the distant, muffled sounds of the changing guards, a pattern of official vigilance that he was now exploiting. He reached the final service stairwell, beginning his swift, silent descent into the functional, forgotten depths of the castle. The air grew immediately cooler, carrying the mineral odor of damp earth and deep stone. He felt a profound sense of wonder at the symmetry of his mission. He was using the logic of the lie, the hidden tunnel, the secret financial protocol, the manufactured history, to save the truth. His rebellion was an administrative one, his weapon a lifetime of expertise in bureaucracy. His microhook was the certainty that the spymaster, looking for a dramatic act of treason, would overlook the quiet, professional burial of history. He reached the furnace level. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of cold ash and stagnant, Coal dust and the ambient imagery was one of total darkness, relieved only by the faint silver light filtering from high vents. This was the place of the decision to burn or to bury. He had chosen burial. He located the coal chute entrance, the massive stone slab that disguised the opening of the archival tunnel. He placed his hand on the cold stone, feeling its immense texture, a final physical barrier between the king's madness and the preservation of his conscience. He knew that the success of his mission, the survival of the records, including the paranoia written in the margin, depended on the next few moments as he applied leverage to the heavy stone, committing the ultimate act of archival treason against the king's own decree. But as he placed his hand on the lever, he knew with terrible certainty that the spy master would not let the records leave the palace so easily. The exit awaited, and so did the silent, calculated threat of his unseen adversary. The air in the Great Hall of Edicts was thin and cold, carrying the residual scent of ozone and scorched paper, the faint metallic tang of bureaucratic finality. This was the chamber where the king's official commands were read and sealed, and today it felt heavier, burdened by the weight of an unprecedented, terrifying instruction. The hall was vast, its high ceilings lost in the pre-dawn gloom, relieved only by the single powerful light source, a massive brass torch burning in a wall sconce, its fierce, unwavering flame casting long, sharp shadows. The light did not soothe, it exposed. On a large marble reading table lay the document itself, the royal decree to simplify the past. It was bound in heavy, deep crimson leather, secured by a complex, newly designed seal that bore the king's personal frantic insignia. The document did not smell of old parchment and history, but of fresh, volatile ink and the urgency of a desperate command. The archivist stood alone before the table, his official duty requiring him to receive and implement the decree. He felt the cold, polished texture of the marble beneath his fingertips, a surface designed to absorb all dissent and reflect only unquestioning loyalty. He knew the decree was not a reform but a reaction, the inevitable bureaucratic outcome of the paranoia written in the margin of the king's private journals. The decree's language was superficially benign, masked by the logic of the Gilded Age administrative boom. It spoke of efficiency, clarity for future students, and the need to eliminate contradictory narratives. But the archivist knew the truth. It was a command for the systematic murder of historical context, driven by the quiet insanity in the Hall of Mirrors. He slowly unrolled the decree. The script was stark, clean, and utterly ruthless. It mandated the immediate creation of a core historical record and the subsequent purging of all documents that provided contradictory evidence, specifically naming the financial secrets of the protocol of the double ledger and the private medical findings of the physician's secretive addenda. He felt a deep professional regret. His entire life had been dedicated to preservation. Now he was ordered to oversee historical destruction. The moral weight of carrying a king's conscience had become too great, forcing him to choose between his oath to the king and his oath to the truth. He recalled his recent clandestine actions, securing the true records with the key to the private bibliothèque, planting the administrative lie, and preparing the escape route in the archival tunnel to the outside wall. The decree was the precise, bureaucratic confirmation of the threat he had already acted against. He paused, resting his hand on the smooth crimson leather. This was the moment of the decision to burn or to bury. The decree demanded burning, but the archivist was committed to silent burial. when the highest law of the land commands a falsehood? Is the quiet preservation of the truth a crime, or the final act of civic duty? He turned his attention to the appendix of the decree, where the implementation team was listed. The name was Stark, confirming his darkest fears. The oversight of the purge was assigned directly to the king's spy master and the silent threat. This meant the archivist had no chance of merely pretending to destroy the records. Every action would be scrutinized by the man who specialized in discovering hidden loyalties. The ambient imagery of the hall was cold and forbidding, the vast space emphasizing the isolation of his dilemma. The shadows cast by the torchlight seemed to lean in, embodying the looming presence of the spy master. He began the slow, deliberate process of copying the purge list into his private cipher. This act of transcription was an act of intellectual treason, saving the list of history's intended victims. The texture of the cipher's paper, rough and familiar, was a comfort against the cold severity of the decree. He noticed a painterly detail on the edge of the decree, a tiny smear of unfamiliar dark blue ink, a smudge that did not match the official black script. It was a minuscule flaw, suggesting the decree had been handled and perhaps amended by someone other than the royal scribe, likely the spy master himself, adding his own ruthless efficiency to the king's frantic paranoia. This was the micro-hook, the realization that the danger was organized, professional, and imminent. The decree was not just a historical cleansing, it was a political trap, designed to expose anyone loyal to the true records of the shadow under the Gilded Age. He completed the transcription, closing the Crimson Decree. He had faced the command and internalized its scope. He was ready to apply the subtle art of document forgery to the most sacred records, transforming them into a public history that became a lie, while simultaneously protecting the authentic past. But he had yet to discover the immediate, terrible consequences of his earlier escape, and the swift, silent retribution that awaited him at the exit of the archival tunnel to the outside wall. The silence in the Great Hall of Edicts, once merely administrative, now felt charged with peril, amplifying the gravity of the royal decree to simplify the past. The archivist secured his cipher, the transcription of the purge list completed, a record of the history the king intended to murder. He moved away from the reading table, the torchlight receding behind him. The air in the connecting corridor was dry, still smelling faintly of the scorched paper and ozone from the sealing process. He felt the cold, hard texture of his personal cipher notebook, his only shield against the total power of the king's spy master and the silent threat. His next task was to initiate the counter-purge, the quiet replacement of the true documents with elaborate forgeries before the spy master's team could begin the destruction. This required the ultimate application of the subtle art of document forgery and the systematic misdirection of his administrative lie, rooted in the protocol of the double ledger. He began by returning to a small side archive, a room dedicated to documents deemed sensitive but not vital. He needed raw material, old, discarded vellum and paper of the correct age to create convincing decoys for the key documents he had rescued using the key to the private bibliothèque. The scent of old paper and stale wheat paste was strong here. He worked quickly, his motions controlled and quiet. He felt a deep, professional curiosity about the nature of deception itself. He was not creating a new history, but a perfect, bureaucratic mirror of the king's desired history, a mirror that would draw the spy master's scrutiny and consume his time. He created a forged summary of fiscal solvency, year 1725, a clean, bold document that directly contradicted the true records detailing the shadow under the Gilded Age. He even added a faint, believable error in the script, a painterly detail that suggested human, rather than malicious, hands. This decoy was designed to be easily discovered and officially accepted, thus satisfying the decree's requirement for a simplified, positive financial narrative. When history demands a lie for the sake of survival, does the archivist become a hero or merely a highly skilled servant of chaos? He felt the heavy, immense weight of carrying a king's conscience, the burden now translated into the immense effort required to manage two parallel historical timelines. The quiet insanity in the Hall of Mirrors was forcing him to commit treason to achieve ethical fidelity. He knew the true psychological engine was the king's fear of personal revelation, driven by the paranoia written in the margin of his private life. Therefore, the decoy for the physician's secretive addenda had to be perfect. The archivist forged a health status report detailing minor ailments, gout, cold weather fatigue, all bland official truths that masked the psychological breakdown. He secured this decoy with a new innocuous wax seal. His medium rhythm, gentle pauses were interrupted only by the rustle of the old paper and the quiet scrape of his pen. He completed the set of replacement documents, the public history that became a lie, meticulously crafted to look like the intended history. He then implemented the final layer of his own protocol, the checkout procedure. Using his knowledge of the registry's legitimate transfer slips, he created a log showing the decoy documents being checked out for immediate review by the spy master's team, ensuring they would fall into the enemy's hands. The ambient imagery of the pre-dawn hour was closing in. The light outside the high, narrow windows was growing slightly less dark, promising the brutal clarity of day. He had to assume the spy master had already exposed the lie of the pest control log and was now actively searching the palace. He had performed the highest form of administrative defense. His emotional cue was a sense of somber finality. The only thing left was the physical act of concealment, the necessary consequence of his decision to burn or to bury. He gathered his final tools and turned towards the hidden service corridors. He needed to reach the one place immune to the king's power and the spy master's scrutiny. The place built on a lie but destined to hold the truth, the archival tunnel to the outside wall. But the archivist knew that the spy master was not a man of patience or administrative process. He would not wait for the paperwork to clear. The final confrontation was not a matter of hours, but of minutes, and it awaited him at the deepest, most critical point of the palace's foundation. The velvet pouch resting beneath the archivist's cloak did not contain gold or jewels. It contained paper. Yet the weight of it felt immense, heavier than any crown. It was the concentrated ethical and historical burden of the kingdom, the weight of carrying a king's conscience. The pouch itself was soft, its texture yielding, but the documents inside felt sharp, brittle, and infinitely precious. He was descending through the palace's hidden service corridors, the air growing colder, damper, carrying the mineral scent of wet lime and deep, untroubled stone. He had narrowly avoided the immediate snare of the king's spy master and the silent threat, after implementing his counter-protocol against the royal decree to simplify the past. Now every step was a commitment to treason, yet also a fidelity to history. The archivist moved with the calm and reflection of a man entirely focused on his duty to a truth higher than his king. His medium rhythm, gentle pauses echoed softly on the rough stone stairs, the only sound betraying his unauthorized descent into the foundations of the palace. The contents of the pouch were the evidence of the king's fall, the private journals detailing, the paranoia written in the margin, the unfiltered medical records of the physician's secretive addenda, and the original financial lies of the shadow under the Gilded Age. This collection represented the king's soul, which the archivist was now tasked with saving from the king himself. He reached the lowest sublevel, a network of medieval utility passages. The ambient imagery here was purely functional: low vaulted ceilings, thick supporting pillars, and the steady faint drip of water. His shielded lantern cast a weak, golden glow that illuminated only the immediate stone beneath his feet, pushing the vast, ancient darkness back only inches at a time. He felt a profound curiosity about the nature of this conscience he carried. It wasn't the weight of past crimes, but the weight of unacknowledged truth. The king's attempts to simplify history were an attempt to shed this burden. But conscience, the archivist knew, was not found in grand official records. It was found in the marginalia, the secret logs, and the documents meant only for private eyes. He paused near a low, narrow archway, the original medieval entrance to the drainage system, now expanded and sealed. This led to the final hiding place, the very structure built on the lie of the protocol of the double ledger, the archival tunnel to the outside wall. He ran his hand along the rough, cold texture of the stone archway. He felt a deep professional wonder at the symmetry. The ultimate lie of the Gilded Age, a secret escape tunnel, was becoming the ultimate truth's sanctuary. He opened the velvet pouch just slightly, inhaling the contained scent of parchment and medicinal herbs. This was his mandate, his justification. He was enacting the decision to burn or to bury, choosing the difficult silent burial over the easy. Public incineration commanded by the decree is the deepest form of loyalty to a king preserving the truth he is desperate to destroy. He had to trust that his administrative smokescreen, the forged logs created with the key to the private bibliothèque, was still holding, drawing the spymaster's attention away from this dark, forgotten corner. The medium rhythm, gentle pauses of his heart competed with the deep, slow thrum of the palace's unseen infrastructure. He stepped through the archway and into the final chamber, the old furnace room. The air was thick with cold ash and coal dust. The light from his lantern caught the rough, dark surface of the stone slab that concealed the tunnel entrance, a massive, unyielding barrier disguised as a coal chute. The painterly detail of the scene was stark. The solitary, robed figure, the immense stone, and the small, vulnerable velvet pouch containing the conscience of a kingdom. He knew that if he succeeded, he would be guilty of treason. If he failed, history itself would become the public history that became a lie. He located the lever mechanism hidden beneath a pile of slack coal. The metal was cold and oily. As he grasped it, he braced himself for the physical effort required to move the slab, a final muscular act against the inertia of the kingdom's deceit. He pulled. The stone slab resisted, then with a deep, grinding groan that echoed slightly in the confined space, it began to move, revealing the absolute, black opening of the tunnel. He realized the immense silent power he held. The weight of carrying a king's conscience was the understanding that he alone could decide which history survived. This realization was his micro-hook, the silent personal vow to complete the burial, regardless of the consequences. But as the opening appeared, a new sharp acrid scent, not of coal, but of polished leather and cold steel, cut through the stagnant air, signaling that the silence of the furnace room was about to be broken by a presence that knew the truth could not be trusted to travel alone. The grinding sound of the stone slab settling open was instantly replaced by the terrifying silence of recognition. The sharp, acrid scent, the smell of fine, hard leather and cold, oiled steel, confirmed the presence of the king's spy master and the silent threat. The archivist did not turn. He merely froze, his hand resting on the heavy lever. The velvet pouch containing the king's conscience nestled beneath his cloak. He felt a deep, chilling regret. His meticulous administrative deception, rooted in the protocol of the double ledger, had delayed the spy master, but the simple physical act of opening the tunnel entrance had served as the final, fatal beacon. The spy master was a hunter of movements, not merely paperwork. A calm, low voice cut through the stillness, a voice as smooth and cold as polished obsidian. "The king's conscience travels light tonight, archivist, but it does not travel alone." The archivist slowly stood, turning to face his adversary. The spy master stood in the low archway, framed by the faint silver light from the higher service vents. He carried no torch, relying on the darkness he commanded. His uniform was dark, his gaze fixed and unwavering. He looked exactly like the efficient, ruthless enforcer required by the royal decree to simplify the past. The archivist kept his tone even, relying on the calm, archival tone that had served as his armor for decades. "These are documents for conservation, spy master. I am following the log." "The log, archivist," the spy master replied, a hint of chilling amusement in his voice, "says these documents are in a climate-controlled vault in the West Wing. Your hands, however, smell of cold ash and damp earth, and your destination is a glorified sewer tunnel built with the financial deceit of the shadow under the Gilded Age. The lie in the ledger is yours, but the lie in the heart is treason." The archivist knew there was no administrative escape now. He had to appeal to a higher universal principle, the very weight of carrying a king's conscience that pressed against his ribs. He gestured toward the bundles. "These hold the key to the king's survival, sir. Not his political survival, but his historical one. They contain the physician's secretive addenda, proof that the king's recent decrees stem from delusion, not governance. If they are burned, the public history that became a lie will forever mark him as a tyrant. If they are hidden, they preserve the context of his tragedy." The painterly detail of the scene was stark. The archivist, illuminated by his own small lantern's muted candlelight, standing on the threshold of the secret tunnel, arguing for truth with the kingdom's executioner. The documents were the only prize. The spy master took a slow step closer. "The king requires a simplified legacy, archivist. He requires a history that does not contradict the mirrors of the quiet insanity in the Hall of Mirrors. Your preservation of his paranoia, written in the margin, is an act of ultimate malice, a guarantee of his posthumous ruin. If one saves a ruler's soul by betraying his command, is the act judged by its intention or its result?" The spy master did not draw a weapon. His threat was entirely psychological. He spoke in a low, even tone, describing the methods by which the archivist's entire life, his cipher, his expertise, his carefully constructed reputation, would be erased, leaving only the official record of his treason. The medium rhythm, gentle pauses of his words were more terrifying than any shout. The archivist clutched the velvet pouch tighter, feeling the brittle texture of the ancient records. He had reached the final decision to burn or to bury, and the spy master was demanding the fire. Suddenly, a massive grinding clang echoed from the tunnel entrance. The stone slab, which the archivist had propped open, slipped, slamming halfway shut, pulled perhaps by the dampness of the stone or a subtle, unseen vibration. The opening was now a narrow, crushing gap. The archivist saw his chance, the brief physical distraction. He took a single, desperate step, throwing the velvet pouch containing the conscience of the king deep into the cold, dark opening of the archival tunnel to the outside wall. The spy master reacted instantly, surging forward not to stop the man, but to retrieve the truth. He reached into the gap, scrambling for the pouch. The archivist felt a wave of profound, historical wonder. The spy master, the hunter, was now trapped in the service of the very truth he sought to destroy. The archivist, having completed his mission, simply stepped back into the shadows, leaving the spy master pinned, grappling with the weight of the king's conscience, caught between the crushing stone and the silent, running darkness of the tunnel. The air in the records annex was utterly still, possessing a dry, powdery scent of ancient paper and cooling charcoal. It was the atmosphere of finalized, accepted history, a place where narratives were meant to rest, undisturbed by the volatile world of the court. Muted candlelight from a single high sconce provided the only illumination, casting long, peaceful stripes of light and shadow across the rows of tightly bound ledgers. The archivist, having just completed the desperate, successful act of burying the king's conscience, now stood in this calm, administrative space. He was here to execute the final necessary act of the subtle art of document forgery, the creation of the perfect administrative lie. His task was to take a legitimate public record and insert a single, decisive entry that contradicted the king's own deepest, most private admission. He felt the cold, hard texture of the oak desk beneath his hands, the wood worn smooth by centuries of quiet labor. Before him lay the great ledger of official expeditions, a vast volume bound in dull official green canvas. The ledger was the public history that became a lie, detailing a seamless, prosperous royal tour conducted months ago. He opened the ledger to the final pages of the tour. The neat flowing script of the royal scribe recorded a triumphant return, confirming the king's health and vigor, a narrative that directly defied the physician's secretive addenda and the private confessions of the paranoia written in the margin. The archivist found the precise line he needed, a simple entry for final disbursement, royal retinue. He was about to write the entry that sealed the public narrative forever, erasing the possibility of retroactive doubt about the king's sanity or the true, hidden cost detailed in the protocol of the double ledger. He dipped his quill into the fresh ink. The scratch of the feather against the heavy paper was sharp and clear in the profound silence. He wrote slowly, deliberately, settled account in full, attested by royal signature and witnessed by chief archivist. He affixed his own signature, a public, formal endorsement of the seamless lie. He paused, resting his hand on the newly dried script. This was the contradiction. The public written affirmation of the king's stability entered at the very moment the archivist was bearing the private proof of his collapse. He felt a profound, chilling regret for the necessity of this betrayal of his own conscience. When history requires a singular, comforting lie, does the act of forgery become an act of state preservation? The painterly detail of the room focused on the contrast between the rigid official script and the inner turmoil of the man writing it. The calm archival tone of the entry masked the treasonous purpose. He was using his skill to build the very illusion the royal decree to simplify the past demanded. He sealed the entry with a small, administrative seal, a final bureaucratic endorsement that guaranteed the lie would stand up to any future scrutiny. He glanced toward the high window, catching the first faint ambient imagery of the coming dawn, a thin line of pale silver on the horizon. His time was nearly over. He closed the great ledger of official expeditions with a soft thud. The sound resonated with the sense of finality that comes with a history permanently fixed. He had committed the ultimate administrative crime. He had formalized the lie. Yet by doing so, he had ensured that the true documents, the real weight of carrying a king's conscience, were safely hidden, awaiting a more honest age. He extinguished his small lantern. The darkness rushed in, thick and absolute. leaving only the memory of the light and the profound silence of the annex. But the archivist had not yet decided what name he would adopt, nor which path he would take after leaving the palace walls, forever separating himself from the public history that became a lie. The chamber the archivist chose for his final act of deception was small and cold, smelling faintly of dry stone and stale glue, an atmosphere of pure quiet utilitarianism. He was seated at a simple, narrow wooden table, the surface darkened and worn smooth by the abrasive motion of countless past repairs to damaged documents. Muted candlelight from a single high sconce gave the room a soft, perpetual twilight, perfect for the practice of the subtle art of document forgery. This act was not about criminal gain. It was about historical deflection. Having buried the true records, the weight of carrying a king's conscience, the archivist now had to construct the perfect decoy history, the seamless public history that became a lie. His instruments were laid out before him, a selection of quills, small vials of custom mixed ink, and thin, sharp bone scrapers used for erasing without tearing the vellum. He picked up a blank sheet of vellum, salvaged from a discarded 17th century ledger. Its texture was rough and brittle, demanding immense care. He needed to create a final, official summary that explained the missing funds from the shadow under the Gilded Age and contradicted the private entry he had recently made. The night the private entry was contradicted, felt a deep professional curiosity about the boundary between his original duty, preserving the truth, and his current necessity, perfecting the lie. The true art of forgery wasn't in copying a signature. It was in replicating the administrative atmosphere of the period. He had to think like the tired, low-paid scribe he was imitating, complete with the slight droop of the letters caused by a cheap quill or the thinness of the ink from a quick morning mix. He dipped his quill into a vial of custom-aged ink, a gear mixture he had perfected to mimic the exact oxidation level of official black gall ink from the era of the royal decree to simplify the past. The scent of the warm ink was sharp, metallic, dominating the small room. He began the transcription, writing a final, definitive declaration of full financial reconciliation for the last quarter. His script was deliberately uneven, mirroring the style of the former royal accountant, whose records contained the protocol of the double ledger. He replicated the accountant's specific habit of starting a new line too far to the left, crowding the inner margin. The calm, archival tone of his work was absolute, transforming his desperate, high-stakes action into a quiet, meditative practice. Every line, every comma was a calculated deviation from the truth. Is the creation of a perfect, believable lie a greater testament to skill than the simple preservation of a difficult truth? He worked for nearly an hour on the single page, constantly comparing his work to an authentic minor receipt from the same period. He used a tiny heated piece of bronze to gently press the completed script, accelerating the drying and aging process of the ink, giving it the subtle, painterly detail of a document settled in time. Next, he took a scroll that had already been officially sealed. This was a treaty summary, meant to be vague but reassuring. He needed to add a single damaging footnote, a false note claiming that the royal household was officially aware of the king's periods of necessary solitude. This small, inserted lie provided a cover story for the psychological truths hidden in the physician's secretive addenda, making the paranoia written in the margin seem like scheduled rest. He applied his bone scraper to the rough vellum, removing the original wax seal with agonizing patience. The texture of the scraped vellum was rough, demanding utmost precision. This was the true subtlety, not just writing a lie, but placing it on an already established truth. He resealed the document with a custom-made, unofficial seal, a small generic one used for internal library transfers. The faint, sweet scent of the wax mingled with the sharp ink. This act sealed the final layer of the decoy. When the king's spymaster and the silent threat reviewed the documentation, they would find not evidence of treason, but a history that perfectly supported the king's simplified narrative. He felt a wave of profound regret and deep historical nostalgia. This skill, meant to restore and repair, was now being used to create an illusion. Yet this illusion was the shield that protected the real documents, now safely in the archival tunnel to the outside wall. From the final, terrible confrontation, the decision to burn or to bury, he gathered his tools, cleaning the table meticulously. He had created the perfect decoy, the perfect lie. His quiet, hypnotic work was complete. But no one knew that the spymaster was not looking for administrative flaws, but a fleeing man, and the archivist's quiet escape was about to intersect with the silent retribution of the court. The silence that followed the archivist's escape was not empty. It was saturated with the chilling presence of the king's spymaster and the silent threat. The air in the furnace room, thick with the scent of cold ash and damp earth, now carried a sharp, metallic odor, the residue of polished leather and barely contained steel, the tools of a professional predator. The archivist, having thrown the king's conscience into the archival tunnel to the outside wall, had vanished into the shadows, leaving his adversary grappling with the partial concealment. The spymaster stood, his dark uniform blending perfectly with the ambient imagery of the utility passage. He was the antithesis of the archivist, not a servant of documented truth, but an enforcer of convenient fiction. His power lay not in the written word, but in the unseen network of eyes and whispers. He was the human consequence of the royal decree to simplify the past. The spymaster did not shout. He did not rage. His reaction was one of cold, precise calculation. He felt the cold, hard texture of the stone slab that had almost crushed him, a physical reminder of the archivist's desperate betrayal. He understood immediately that the archivist's actions, the meticulous misfiling, the forged logs, the entire administrative fiction, were merely the subtle art of document forgery designed to buy time for this final act of burial. He knew the contents of the hidden pouch, the documents detailing the shadow under the Gilded Age, the frantic scribbles of the paranoia written in the margin, and the fragile notes of the physician's secretive addenda. He recognized the immense weight of carrying a king's conscience that the archivist had jettisoned. His task was to retrieve that conscience and burn it, ensuring that the public history that became a lie remained clean and simple. The spymaster moved to the tunnel opening. He lit a slender, specialized lantern, not a copper archive lamp, but one designed for covert movement, casting a thin, intensely focused beam of muted candlelight into the absolute darkness of the tunnel. The painterly detail of the scene was stark. The cold geometry of the stone and the solitary, resolute figure of the enforcer. He saw the velvet pouch just feet inside the tunnel, snagged on a protruding shard of rock. He could easily retrieve it, but he hesitated, his mind working through the implications. The spymaster did not trust simplicity. He knew the archivist was a master of the protocol of the double ledger, a man who always dealt in layers of deception. Was the pouch a decoy? Or was the act of throwing it away the archivist's final honest testimony? He felt a rare flicker of professional curiosity about his adversary. The archivist had risked his life not for gold, but for the historical record, a kind of dedication that the spymaster found both foolish and profoundly admirable. What silent loyalty compels a man to betray his sovereign for the sake of words that will be read a century hence? The spy master knew that retrieving the pouch was only the first step. The archivist himself was the greater silent threat. He carried the cipher, the key to the private bibliothèque, and the memory of the true history in his mind. The spy master realized his objective was no longer the documents, but the man who understood the code. He sent a quiet practice signal to his hidden informants, instructing them to sweep the upper floors, a deceptive move, knowing the archivist was likely still nearby. He then turned his attention back to the tunnel. He decided not to enter. Instead, he used a long hooked rod, designed for retrieving fallen keys, to gently pull the velvet pouch back toward the opening. He would examine the documents and then dispatch a reliable man into the tunnel to confirm the route was clear. As the pouch slid across the damp, rough stone, the spy master watched the shadows where the archivist had disappeared, aware that his greatest danger now lay in the unseen, in the intricate, hidden historical narrative that the archivist had set in motion with the night the private entry was contradicted. The retrieval was complete. He held the pouch, its texture soft, its contents heavy. The spy master knew that the quiet, administrative betrayal of the archivist was far more dangerous than any armed rebellion. The archivist had forced him into the service of the destruction of truth, a mission he would execute with terrifying, silent efficiency. But no one knew that the spy master's single act of retrieval would lead him into an impossible choice, a consequence planted by his adversary in the final, dark section of the archival tunnel to the outside wall. The stillness in the deepest sub-level of the palace was absolute, broken only by the faint, irregular drip of water on cold stone, a sound that measured the slow, indifferent passage of time. The air was thick with the conflicting scent of cold ash and stagnant coal dust, layered with the delicate, dry odor of parchment from the documents recovered. This quiet, ancient place was the site of the most profound ethical dilemma, the decision to burn or to bury. The velvet pouch, containing the weight of carrying a king's conscience, lay open on a stone bench. The archivist had successfully thrown it into the tunnel opening, evading the immediate grasp of the king's spy master and the silent threat, who was now committed to following the trail. The archivist had escaped the physical threat, but the moral choice remained. He stood near the coal chute opening that disguised the archival tunnel to the outside wall, the physical manifestation of the king's paranoia written in the margin. His earlier decision to choose burial over incineration was now being tested by the brutal reality of the spy master's pursuit. He felt the rough, cold texture of the stone wall beneath his hand, a tangible anchor in this moment of high-stakes historical risk. The small copper lantern he had retrieved cast a weak, golden glow, creating a solitary circle of muted candlelight that illuminated the crucial documents. He looked at the pouch's contents, the brittle financial ledgers detailing the shadow under the Gilded Age, the frantic private journals, and the sensitive notes of the physician's secretive addenda. These were the truths that, if burned, would perfectly satisfy the royal decree to simplify the past, guaranteeing the archivist's own safety and the public tranquility based on the public history that became a lie. He felt a deep professional regret. Burning was clean, fast, and final. It would eliminate the treasonous evidence of the night the private entry was contradicted, and guarantee the seamless execution of the subtle art of document forgery he had put in place. The lie would hold forever, but burying, hiding the truth in the damp, dark tunnel was an act of faith, a commitment to a future he might never see. It meant accepting the lifelong burden of being the only witness to the original unflinching truth. He knelt, picking up a handful of loose coal dust. Its texture was fine and gritty. He thought of the king, driven mad by the contradiction of his own history. If these documents were destroyed, the king might find a terrible final peace. Relieved of the burden of his conscience, does preservation of the complete, difficult truth override the human need for peace, even the peace of a troubled king? He felt a wave of profound wonder at the power of this choice. He was in this dark utilitarian room, acting as the sole judge of the kingdom's historical soul. The weight of carrying a king's conscience required him to choose the more difficult path. He placed the documents back into the velvet pouch, securing the tie with a precise archival knot. He would not burn them. He would commit them to the dark, uncertain keeping of the tunnel, relying on the logic of the protocol of the double ledger, the idea that something is safest when it is too difficult and too dangerous to be found. He applied his full weight to the stone lever, forcing the slab to open wide again. The blackness of the archival tunnel to the outside wall yawned before him, smelling of cold running water and absolute darkness. This was his final sanctuary. He tossed the pouch deep inside, past the reach of any casual searcher, past the point where the tunnel narrowed. He heard the faint, dull thud as the conscience of the king came to rest on the damp stone floor within the darkness. He did not look back. He released the lever, and with a terrible, slow groan, the stone slab slid shut, sealing the truth away, leaving only the sound of his own breathing and the scent of the coal dust in the air. His decision was made. But no one knew whether the spymaster had been truly delayed, or if the conscience of the king, now buried, would ever be recovered from the silent depths of the archival tunnel to the outside wall. The air inside the newly opened passage was sharply cold, carrying the clean, honest scent of damp earth and raw, undisturbed stone. This was the true atmosphere of the palace's foundation, utterly devoid of the elaborate perfumes and political artifice of the upper chambers. The archival tunnel to the outside wall was not meant to be a historical monument. It was built on a lie, documented through the fraudulent figures of the protocol of the double ledger, and intended for a paranoid escape. The archivist slipped through the narrow gap where the coal chute once lay, leaving the massive stone slab to settle quietly back into place. He was now separated from the heart of the palace and the immediate threat of the king's spymaster, and the silent threat. His mission, the decision to burn or to bury, was complete, the king's conscience safely hidden. He carried no light. The darkness here was absolute, thick and suffocating. He relied solely on his memory of the tunnel's blueprints, the rough secret maps he had transcribed from the financial records. He felt the cold, jagged texture of the tunnel wall with one hand, guiding himself forward. He felt a deep sense of wonder at the symmetry of his fate. The tunnel, intended by the king to be a private path to freedom from his perceived enemies, was now the sanctuary for the very truths the king feared most, the paranoia written in the margin and the financial disgrace of the shadow under the gilded age. The tunnel was the only part of the palace where the public history that became a lie could not penetrate. He moved with a slow, deliberate shuffle, navigating the uneven floor. The only sounds were the soft, scraping medium rhythm, gentle pauses of his woolen cloak against the stone, and the faint, constant drip of water, the quiet clockwork of the earth. He stopped where the tunnel floor dipped steeply. He knew this was the location of the hidden cache, the spot where the velvet pouch containing the conscience of the king had landed. He reached down into the cold, shallow water, his hand searching the rough stone for the distinctive texture of the velvet. His fingers closed around the cold, damp pouch. He pulled it close, feeling the light but profoundly significant weight of the documents, the private journals, the financial truths, and the sensitive notes of the physician's secretive addenda. When a secret is protected by darkness and stone, Does it truly belong to the keeper or to the earth itself? He continued onward, deeper into the tunnel. The ambient imagery was purely auditory, the sound of his own heavy breathing and the faint, distant echo of a running stream, signaling he was nearing the outside wall. The air here was pristine, untainted by courtly deception. He felt a quiet, profound regret for the life he was leaving behind, the certainty of his office, the comfort of the parchment. He was an archivist without an archive, his only possession the weight of carrying a king's conscience. He realized the immense power in his act of intellectual subversion. By burying the documents, he had not only fulfilled his sworn duty, but had also rendered the royal decree to simplify the past utterly meaningless. The king could burn every decoy and every public record, but the fundamental truth remained safe, preserved by the king's own paranoia. He reached the end of the tunnel, where the stone gave way to a crude barricade of packed earth and loose stones, easily moved from the inside. A thin, horizontal seam of pale light, the silver edge of the pre-dawn, was visible through a crack. The first real light he had seen since the night the private entry was contradicted. He pushed gently on the stones, widening the opening. The scent of fresh, cold air rushed into the tunnel, a powerful, clean contrast to the stagnant air he had breathed for hours. He was looking out onto the world outside the palace wall, a world that knew nothing of the silent, desperate history hidden in the darkness behind him. He was safe, the truth was hidden, and the new public history that became a lie was about to commence above. But no one knew what name the archivist would take, nor the quiet, necessary destiny that awaited him as the final guardian of the public history that became a lie. The light of the new morning was pale and indifferent, filtering through the high arched windows of the royal registry. The air within the grand hall was strangely clean, carrying the crisp, thin scent of ozone and new paper, a smell that signaled not preservation, but systematic administrative cleansing. The silence was absolute, heavier than any physical weight. For this was the moment the public history that became a lie took its place as official, unassailable truth. The archivist, having vanished through the archival tunnel to the outside wall, was gone, leaving behind only the evidence of his administrative deception, the meticulously crafted decoy documents and the empty physical spaces where the real history once lay. The palace was now engaged in the seamless, quiet implementation of the royal decree to simplify the past. The centerpiece of this deception was the Hall of Mirrors, where the king, relieved of the psychological burden of the paranoia, written in the margin and the financial strain of the shadow under the Gilded Age, appeared publicly. The mirrors reflected an image of unshakable serenity, a visual confirmation of the streamlined, false narrative. The historian royal, a man whose loyalty was to the crown rather than the facts, stood before a committee, presenting the freshly printed core historical record. This document, devoid of contradictory evidence, was the masterful culmination of the subtle art of document forgery that the archivist himself had set in motion. It was clean, smooth, and smelled faintly of expensive, unnecessary floral perfume, the scent of a lie carefully packaged. Every piece of the false narrative fit perfectly. The massive financial deficit was now presented as a manageable cost of expanding the Gilded Age trade routes. The psychological breakdown documented in the physician's secretive addenda was erased, replaced by the bland official account of restorative solitude, confirming the night the private entry was contradicted with seamless authority. The archivist's administrative decoys, designed using the complex logic of the protocol of the double ledger, had worked perfectly. The king's spy master and the silent threat, after a quick, fruitless search of the tunnel's opening, found the decoy documents where the archivist intended, neatly filed and tagged for official review. The spymaster, a man who respected efficient administrative process above all, confirmed the documents adhered to the decree and ordered their final destruction. He felt a deep sense of regret for the quiet scholars of the future, those who would labor over this clean, flawless record and never suspect the profound ethical dilemma, the decision to burn or to bury, that had created it. They would never feel the weight of carrying a king's conscience. That burden lay forgotten in the darkness of the tunnel. The new history was accepted instantly. It required no critical thought, no messy interpretations. It was singular, soothing, and easily understood. It lacked the texture of real human failure, the grit of moral contradiction, and the complexity of truth. When the ultimate goal of governance is placid stability, does the deliberate simplification of history become a moral imperative? The palace quickly forgot the archivist, his name purged from the official duty rosters, his disappearance attributed to unscheduled retirement for health reasons. A final, small administrative lie. The tarnished brass of the key to the private bibliothèque was now quietly melted down, its existence erased from the physical world. The painterly detail of the new history was one of false brilliance. Bold titles, rich colors, and aggressive, confident prose entirely unlike the small, hesitant scribbles of the authentic record. The true history, the king's conscience, now rested in the absolute darkness beneath the massive palace wall. It was cold, damp, and utterly silent, awaiting a day when a more honest age might stumble upon its hidden entrance. The medium rhythm, gentle pauses of the slow drip of water onto the stone was its only clock. The archivist, far away now, walked under a vast, open sky, the scent of parchment slowly fading from his clothing. He was a man with no name, no home, and no record, the solitary guardian of a truth the world was not ready to receive. He was the only person who knew that the beautiful, new history of the kingdom was in fact a magnificent, comprehensive lie. He knew that centuries later a quiet scholar, perhaps one specializing in the strange financial anomalies of the Gilded Age, might find a single, cryptic reference in an old deed or a forgotten map, a clue leading to the foundation of the palace and the opening of the long-forgotten tunnel. But no one knew the new name the archivist had taken, nor the quiet, necessary destiny that awaited him as the final guardian of the public history that became a lie.